By the time Eleanor May Carter entered the school gymnasium, the parents had already decided she was guilty.
Everyone here deserves to see who was responsible.
Some of them had spent the night beside hospital beds, terrified after their children became sick from lunch at Willowbrook Academy. They wanted someone to blame, and the school had given them the easiest person in the building to hate.
Willowbrook will not tolerate negligence where children's lives are concerned.
Not the principal who had ignored the warning before anything happened.
The children need the truth more than they need someone to blame.
Not the operations director who had approved the cheaper food supplier behind the scenes.
Do not make this worse for yourself.
Not the board members who cared more about reputation than the safety of the children. They gave them Eleanor, the old lunch lady in the faded cafeteria uniform. She stood beneath the bright gym lights with her hands folded, while sealed lunch trays waited like evidence. Wealthy parents whispered, cried, and stared as if 12 years of kindness had suddenly become a crime.
We are reviewing the actions of the employee closest to the food service.
But earlier that day, Eleanor had seen something wrong in the cafeteria before anyone else understood the danger.
Please bring the school nurse here now.
In her pocket was a small notebook filled with names, allergies, symptoms, and the exact times everything began. It was not the notebook of a careless cafeteria worker. It was the notebook of a nurse, and she had saved them.
Before this ends, you will know who really protected them.
Long before the parents of Willowbrook Academy filled the gymnasium with anger, long before sealed lunch trays were placed on a table, like criminal evidence, long before Eleanor May Carter stood under those bright lights, with the whole school looking at her as if she had tried to hurt the children she loved, she had been known for one simple thing. She remembered every child. Not in the way teachers remembered grades, or administrators remembered tuition records, or board members remembered last names attached to donations. Eleanor remembered the details that did not appear in glossy school brochures. She remembered which first grader needed his sandwich cut smaller, because he still panicked when food felt too large in his mouth. She remembered which little girl pretended not to like apples because her loose tooth made them hurt. She remembered which boy from the scholarship program came through the lunch line smiling too brightly on Mondays because weekends in his house did not always include enough food. She remembered allergies, fears, quiet embarrassments, missing lunch cards, and the children who stood at the back of the line pretending they were not hungry because pride was sometimes the only thing a child owned. To most people at Willowbrook, she was just the lunch lady. That was what they called her when they were being polite. When they were not being polite, they called her the old woman in the cafeteria, the one with the faded apron, the cheap shoes, and the hands that moved too slowly during rush hour. Some parents did not know her name at all. They only knew that she stood behind the serving counter with a hairnet, a ladle, and a face that seemed to belong to a different world than the one Willowbrook sold to the public. Willowbrook Academy was the kind of school that never described itself as rich, because rich schools preferred words like distinguished, selective, historic, and exceptional. Its main building had tall windows, polished floors, and a stone entrance where prospective families paused for photographs. The admissions office smelled like fresh flowers and expensive coffee. The walls were covered with framed college acceptance letters, championship banners, and carefully staged pictures of smiling children in clean uniforms. Every year, the school printed a brochure promising that Willowbrook did not simply educate students, it formed future leaders. But Eleanor knew what every old building knew. A place could shine in the front and rot quietly in the back. The cafeteria was not in the brochure. It sat behind the arts wing, past a hallway where the paint had begun to peel near the baseboards, and the heating vents rattled every winter. The kitchen had old ovens, chipped tiles, a walk-in refrigerator that hummed too loudly, and a loading door where suppliers dropped off crates before sunrise. It was not beautiful, but Eleanor treated it like a place that mattered. She wiped the counters twice when once would have been enough. She checked expiration dates, even when the delivery men rolled their eyes. She kept a small notebook in the pocket of her apron and wrote down things no one had asked her to track. To the school, that notebook looked like a habit. To Eleanor, it was protection. There were names inside it, dozens of them, written in careful blue ink. Children with peanut allergies. Children who could not have dairy. Children who had asthma. Children whose parents forgot to update medical forms. Children who became dizzy if they skipped breakfast. Children who needed to sit after running. Children who hid medication in backpacks because they were embarrassed to go to the nurse's office. Eleanor kept the notebook because she knew paperwork could be late, systems could fail, and adults could be careless when no one forced them to look closely. She had learned that lesson in another life. Before Willowbrook, before the cafeteria uniform, before parents looked past her as if she were part of the furniture, Eleanor had worn scrubs under brighter lights than any school gymnasium. She had spent 27 years as an emergency nurse at St. Agnes Medical Center, where time was measured in heartbeats and mistakes did not wait for committee meetings. She had known the sound of a child struggling to breathe before a monitor confirmed it. She had known when a mother's calm voice was hiding terror. She had known how quickly a normal afternoon could become the worst day of a family's life. She had been good at it. Not famous. Nurses rarely were. But the doctors trusted her eyes, and younger nurses learned to watch her hands. Eleanor could enter a room and sense what was wrong before the chart had fully loaded. She noticed color, breath, sweat, posture, pupils, panic. She knew when someone was pretending to be fine, and when someone did not have the strength to pretend anymore. For years, she saved lives without speeches, without applause, and without anyone outside the hospital knowing her name. Then one winter night changed the shape of her forever. A little boy had come into the emergency room too late. He had been quiet, too quiet, the way very sick children sometimes were. His mother kept apologizing for not bringing him sooner, as if poverty, fear, and bad transportation were personal failures instead of the traps they often became. Eleanor did everything right. The team did everything right. But sometimes doing everything right still leaves you standing beside a bed after the machines stop, holding the silence like broken glass. People told Eleanor it was not her fault. They told her she could not save everyone. They told her experience would help her survive grief. They were wrong about that last part. Experience did not make grief smaller. It only made it more precise. After that night, Eleanor found that she could still do the work, but she could no longer leave the hospital without hearing the mother's apology in her head. She could no longer pass a child in the grocery store without checking the color of his lips. She could no longer sleep through a siren. Eventually, she retired earlier than anyone expected, not because she had stopped caring, but because she had cared so deeply for so long that something inside her had worn thin. Willowbrook was supposed to be quieter. That was what she told herself when she took the cafeteria job. Children eating lunch, trays sliding across counters, fruit cups, soup, pasta, warm rolls, milk cartons. No trauma bay, no alarms, no doctors calling for equipment, no mothers praying in hallways, just ordinary care, the kind no one noticed unless it disappeared. And for a while, that was enough. The children noticed her before the adults did. Children often have a sharper eye for kindness than grown people. They noticed that Eleanor never made them feel ashamed if their lunch account was low. They noticed she placed extra crackers on the trays of children who looked tired. They noticed that if someone dropped food and looked ready to cry, Eleanor would quietly replace it before anyone could laugh. They noticed that she never called attention to the students who needed free meals. At Willowbrook, where some children arrived in cars that cost more than Eleanor's house, dignity was not a small gift. It was survival. But the adults saw something else. They saw an older woman with no degree hanging on the cafeteria wall. They saw a uniform instead of a history. They saw someone useful, replaceable, and safely beneath them. Principal Preston Vale, especially, saw her that way. Dr. Preston Vale had built his career on sounding compassionate in rooms where compassion was useful. He had a polished voice, silver hair, and the kind of smile that made donors feel their money was becoming virtue. He spoke often about safety, excellence, and the sacred trust of educating children. He knew how to pause before important words. He knew how to place one hand over his heart at assemblies. He knew how to make parents believe Willowbrook was not just a school, but a shield. Eleanor had worked around emergencies too long to be fooled by calm voices. She had seen men like Preston Vale in hospitals, not the cruel kind who shouted, the worst kind, the kind who spoke softly while moving blame away from themselves, the kind who never dirtied their hands, yet somehow always stood far from the consequences, Still, Eleanor kept her distance. She was not there to challenge him. She was there to feed children. The real trouble began when Willowbrook changed food suppliers. For years, the cafeteria had used a local family company. The produce was not perfect, but it was clean, familiar, and delivered by people who answered questions directly. Eleanor knew the delivery drivers. She knew which crates came from which farms. She knew what the lettuce should smell like when it was fresh, and what chicken looked like when it had been rushed through a bad cooler. It was not a glamorous system, but it worked because the people inside it cared enough to be embarrassed when something went wrong. Then Marissa Lang arrived. Marissa was Willowbrook's new director of operations, hired to modernize the school's internal systems, which was the kind of phrase that often meant cutting costs without saying cutting costs. She was young, sharp, and always dressed as if she expected to be photographed near a ribbon-cutting ceremony. She carried a tablet everywhere and spoke about efficiency as if it were a moral virtue. Within 3 months, she had replaced the old supplier with a regional food distributor that offered lower prices, cleaner invoices, and brochures full of smiling farms that Eleanor had never heard of. Eleanor asked questions the first morning the new delivery arrived. No one thanked her for it. The crates looked right at a glance. The labels were neat. The boxes were stacked properly. The delivery sheet was clean. But Eleanor had learned long ago that danger often entered a room looking organized. She noticed condensation where it should not have been. She noticed one container of pre-cut fruit smelled faintly sour beneath the sweetness. She noticed sealed bags of greens that looked too wet inside, as if they had been washed, sealed, warmed, and chilled again. Most people would have missed it. Most people were allowed to miss it. Eleanor was not. She told Marissa the produce needed to be inspected before serving. Marissa did not listen with her ears. She listened with her title. She reminded Eleanor, in that smooth administrative way, that the supplier had already passed the required checks. She explained that the school could not delay lunch service because an employee had an uncomfortable feeling about sealed food. She suggested that perhaps Eleanor was struggling with new procedures and should allow trained operations staff to handle vendor compliance. It was a polite way of telling her to stay behind the counter. Eleanor did not argue loudly. Loudness had never been her way. But from that day forward, she wrote more in her notebook. Delivery times, lot numbers when she could see them, temperature readings from the cafeteria thermometer, children who complained about stomach aches after certain meals, food that arrived too close to expiration, containers that looked wrong, patterns too small for administrators to care about, and too large for Eleanor to ignore. She brought the concerns to the school nurse first. The nurse was kind, but overwhelmed, responsible for hundreds of students, medication forms, scraped knees, headaches, panic attacks, and parents who believed every sneeze deserved an immediate phone call. She promised to mention it to administration. Eleanor knew from the way she lowered her voice that the promise was sincere and probably useless. Then Eleanor wrote a memo. She did not use dramatic language. She knew better. Dramatic language made people defensive. She listed dates, symptoms, delivery concerns, and her recommendation that Willowbrook pause service from the new supplier until an independent inspection could be completed. She placed one copy in Marissa's inbox and another in the principal's office. Days passed. Nothing changed. The new supplier kept coming. The invoices kept shrinking. Marissa's confidence grew. Preston Vale praised her at a staff meeting for responsible stewardship of school resources. Board members liked numbers that moved in the right direction. Parents liked tuition increases that could be delayed another year. No one wanted to know why savings had appeared so quickly, because quick savings feel like intelligence until someone gets hurt. Eleanor kept feeding children, and every day, the cafeteria became a little harder for her to trust. There was one child she watched more closely than the others. His name was Caleb Morrison, a 7-year-old with round glasses, restless hands, and a peanut allergy severe enough that Eleanor had written his name on the first page of her notebook and underlined it twice. Caleb was the kind of child who apologized when other people bumped into him. He came through the lunch line with careful politeness, always thanking Eleanor, as if she had prepared the food just for him. His mother, Hannah Morrison, was a nurse's aide at a senior home and one of the few parents who knew Eleanor's name. She worked long shifts and arrived at school events in shoes that looked too tired for the polished hallways. Willowbrook liked scholarship families and photographs, but in real life, people like Hannah were often made to feel grateful for standing in spaces their children had earned. Eleanor understood that feeling. So she watched Caleb. She checked labels twice when he came through the line. She kept safe snacks in a separate container. She made sure no one mocked him when he asked what was in a sauce. Caleb trusted her, and that trust frightened her more than disrespect ever had. Disrespect could be endured. Trust had to be protected. The day of the poisoning began beautifully. That was the detail Eleanor would remember later with a bitterness that tasted almost like metal. The sky was bright. The school lawn had been trimmed. A group of wealthy prospective parents were touring campus, guided by Preston Vale himself. The children were excited because lunch included roasted chicken, fruit cups, and a bright green salad the school planned to feature in promotional photographs about healthy meals. Marissa moved through the cafeteria before service with unusual energy, adjusting table displays and reminding staff that presentation mattered. Eleanor was at the loading door when the produce arrived. She knew something was wrong before she opened the first crate. There was a sharpness beneath the cold smell, faint but present, like chemicals hiding under wet leaves. She lifted one sealed bag of greens and saw moisture gathered inside in a way that made her stomach tighten. Another bag had leaves darkening at the edges. The printed date looked acceptable, but dates were not magic. They could not tell you where food had been held, how long it had sat warm, or whether someone had cleaned a processing line properly before sealing the next shipment. Eleanor cut open one bag away from the prep table. The smell rose stronger. Not rotten exactly. Worse, clean in the wrong way. Artificial. Chemical. The kind of smell that made the old nurse inside her stand up straight. Before the cafeteria worker could talk herself into calm, she told the kitchen staff not to serve the salad. Some listened immediately because they knew Eleanor did not panic. Others froze, looking toward Marissa, because at Willowbrook, authority did not always belong to the person who knew what she was doing. Marissa arrived within minutes, irritated by the delay, and found Eleanor standing between the prep table and the trays, as if her body could become a rule no one else had the courage to write. Eleanor explained what she had found. She asked that the greens be pulled and the supplier contacted. She asked for the nurse to be alerted, not because children were sick yet, but because prevention was always quieter than rescue. Marissa saw only disruption. There were guests on campus. There were parents touring the cafeteria. There were board members coming through in less than an hour. The healthy lunch program was part of that day's presentation. A missing salad would raise questions. Questions would lead to explanations. Explanations would lead to Marissa's supplier contract. And the one thing people like Marissa feared more than danger was inconvenience that pointed upward. So the salad stayed. Not all of it. Eleanor managed to keep several trays back. She quietly removed portions from the line whenever she could. She warned 2 staff members to watch for stomach pain, dizziness, rash, or breathing trouble. She slipped safe fruit to Caleb instead of the prepared cup from the new delivery. But a cafeteria is not a battlefield one person can control forever. Lunch service moved quickly. Children laughed, trays slid forward, teachers hurried them along, and the adults who should have stopped everything chose not to see the old woman trying to hold back a tide with her hands. The first child became sick before the lunch period ended. A little girl near the 3rd grade table put her head down and said her stomach hurt. A teacher assumed she had eaten too fast. Then another child began sweating. Then a boy near the window vomited into his lap and started crying from embarrassment before fear caught up with him. Eleanor heard the change in the room before anyone named it. The pitch of children's voices shifted. The air tightened. Chairs scraped. A teacher called for the nurse. Then Caleb Morrison began to wheeze. That sound cut through Eleanor like a blade sharpened years ago. She moved before anyone told her to. The lunch line, the uniforms, the years away from the hospital, the way people underestimated her, all of it fell away. What remained was training, memory, and the terrible clarity of a child who could not breathe. She reached Caleb before the teacher beside him understood the danger. She knew where his emergency medication was supposed to be. She knew the difference between panic and an airway closing. She knew to keep him upright, to watch his lips, to keep the crowd back, to make someone call emergency services with specific words instead of useless panic. And while everyone else saw chaos, Eleanor saw categories. The children with stomach symptoms, the children with rash, the children with breathing trouble, the ones who had eaten salad, the ones who had only taken fruit, the ones who needed immediate transport, the ones who could wait under observation. She began giving instructions in a voice so steady that adults obeyed, before remembering they did not think of her as important. For several minutes, Willowbrook Academy was no longer run by its principal, its operations director, or its board. It was run by the lunch lady. By the time ambulances arrived, Eleanor had written times in her notebook, with hands that did not shake until later. She had marked Caleb's reaction. She had listed the children who ate from the suspect trays. She had kept one sealed bag aside and hidden it in the back of the refrigerator because she no longer trusted the people who had ignored her warning to preserve the evidence. Then, Preston Vale entered the cafeteria. He did not see what Eleanor had prevented. He saw what could destroy him. Children were crying. Teachers were pale. Parents on the campus tour were being hurried away by staff who smiled too hard. Paramedics moved in and out. Marissa stood near the kitchen entrance, white-faced, already calculating which version of the story would save her. Eleanor looked at the principal and knew, before he spoke, that he was not searching for the truth. He was searching for a place to put the blame. By late afternoon, the first message went out to parents. It spoke of a possible food safety incident. It promised full cooperation with authorities. It assured families that Willowbrook's leadership was taking immediate action. Eleanor read none of it. She was still at the school, sitting alone in the cafeteria after the last ambulance left, staring at the empty tables where children had been laughing only hours before. Marissa came for the notebook first. Not openly, not with accusation. She approached Eleanor with a careful softness that made the old nurse in her colder than anger ever could. She suggested that all personal notes from the incident should be turned over to administration for proper documentation. She spoke as if the notebook were school property, as if Eleanor's observations belonged to the very people who had ignored them. Eleanor did not hand it over. That was the moment Marissa's face changed. Only for a second. But Eleanor saw it. By evening, parents were at the hospital. Rumors had reached local news. Willowbrook's board was demanding answers. The supplier had stopped returning calls. And somewhere between the first parent's accusation and the first reporter's camera outside the school gates, Preston Vale made his decision. The story would not be about ignored warnings. It would not be about a cheaper supplier. It would not be about a director of operations who had pushed unsafe food through lunch service because appearances mattered more than caution. It would be about Eleanor May Carter, the old cafeteria worker, the woman with no powerful family, no expensive lawyer, no title that sounded impressive on television, the woman who had spent 12 years feeding children and one terrible afternoon saving them. When Eleanor arrived at school the next morning, the cafeteria door was locked. 2 administrators were waiting for her. They did not shout. Willowbrook rarely shouted. They told her she had been placed on leave pending investigation. They asked her not to speak with parents. They told her the gymnasium meeting would allow the school community to receive an appropriate update. They said her presence would be required. Required. That was the word they used. Not invited. Not protected. Not represented. Required. Eleanor looked through the small window in the cafeteria door. Inside, the counters had been scrubbed too clean. The trash had been removed. The trays were gone. The refrigerator where she had hidden the sealed bag was marked with a maintenance notice. The kitchen already looked like a room being taught how to lie. For the first time since the children got sick, Eleanor felt fear. Not for herself. She had survived worse than humiliation. She had stood beside death and kept working. She had lived long enough to know that reputation could be ruined by people who never once looked you in the eye. She was afraid because she understood what Willowbrook was about to do. If they could make everyone believe she was careless, then no one would ask why her warning had been ignored. If they could make parents hate her, then parents would stop looking upward. If they could turn the lunch lady into the villain, the school could present itself as the victim of one employee's negligence. And the children would never know who had truly put them in danger. So Eleanor reached into her apron pocket and touched the notebook. Inside were the names, the times, the symptoms, the warnings, the details no administrator had bothered to learn. It was not enough yet. She knew that. A notebook could be dismissed as self-protection. An old woman's notes could be called confusion, panic, even guilt. People with power knew how to make truth look small. But Eleanor also knew something they did not. Willowbrook had cameras in places administrators forgot about. Student cameras, media club cameras, old hallway cameras no one checked unless a trophy went missing or a donor's child complained. And the day before the poisoning, Eleanor had seen a red recording light blinking above the cafeteria service hall. She did not know what it had captured. Not yet. But she knew the truth had a way of surviving in corners powerful people forgot to clean. That morning, as she walked toward the gymnasium where hundreds of angry parents waited for someone to blame, Eleanor did not look like a woman preparing to fight. She looked like a tired cafeteria worker in a faded uniform, carrying nothing but an old notebook and 12 years of being underestimated. And that was exactly why Preston Vale believed she would be easy to destroy. The gymnasium at Willowbrook Academy had been designed for celebration. It was where the school held award ceremonies, scholarship announcements, basketball victories, choir performances, and the kind of polished assemblies that made parents believe their children were growing up inside an institution built on honor. The banners hanging from the walls spoke of excellence, leadership, integrity, and service. The floor had been polished that morning until the overhead lights reflected against it like glass. Rows of chairs faced a temporary podium, and behind that podium stood a long table covered in white cloth, with sealed lunch trays placed in a careful line. To the parents, those trays looked like evidence. To Eleanor, they looked like children. She could not look at them without seeing Caleb Morrison's small hand gripping the edge of the cafeteria table, without hearing the first wet gasp in his throat, without remembering the little girl who had tried to apologize after vomiting because she thought she had done something wrong. Food should never have become a thing children feared. A lunch tray should have been ordinary, forgettable, safe. That was the part that hurt Eleanor most. Not the whispers, not the stares, not even the way two administrators had walked beside her as if she were already dangerous. It was the knowledge that someone had taken something as simple as lunch and allowed greed to make it unsafe. When she entered the gym, the sound changed. Not silence exactly. Silence would have been kinder. What came over the room was a tightening, a collective intake of anger that had been waiting for a face. Parents turned in their chairs. Some had red eyes from hospital nights. Some held phones in their hands, recording before anything had been said. Some looked exhausted, frightened, and desperate enough to believe the first explanation offered to them, because uncertainty is a cruel thing to leave beside a child's hospital bed. Eleanor understood their anger. That was what made it harder. She knew what it was to sit beside a child and bargain silently with God, medicine, time, and memory. She knew what fear could do to a parent. Fear could make a kind person brutal. It could make a thoughtful person hungry for punishment before truth had even arrived. She did not hate the parents for looking at her that way, but she did hate the people who had pointed them in her direction. Principal Preston Vale stood at the podium in a dark suit, his face arranged into solemn concern. Beside him sat two members of the board, Marissa Lang, and the school's attorney, a narrow man who kept his hands folded as if stillness could make him seem trustworthy. The school nurse sat farther down the row, pale and uncomfortable, her eyes avoiding Eleanor's for reasons that looked less like guilt than fear. Eleanor noticed that immediately. The nurse had tried to raise concerns after the first memo. Eleanor knew that. Now she was sitting behind the same table as the people who had ignored her, and her silence looked like a bruise. Preston began by thanking parents for their patience during what he called a deeply painful incident. He spoke of the school's responsibility to protect every child and promised that Willowbrook would cooperate fully with health officials. His voice had the slow weight of practiced grief. He paused in the right places. He lowered his eyes when mentioning the children in hospital care. He used words like accountability and transparency, though he had chosen that morning to lock the cafeteria before Eleanor could enter it. Then he turned slightly toward her. He did not say outright that she had poisoned anyone. He was too careful for that. Men like Preston did not place blame with a hammer when a silk cord would do. He spoke instead of preliminary concerns, of food handling irregularities, of deviations from established procedures, of an employee whose personal notes suggested she had acted outside approved protocol. He made Eleanor's notebook sound suspicious without showing anyone what was inside it. He made her caution sound like incompetence. He made her refusal to surrender her notes sound like obstruction. Eleanor stood near the side of the gym, not at the table, not among the staff, not given a chair. That detail was not accidental. It placed her where the parents could see her as separate from the institution. Willowbrook was the school. Preston was the leadership. Marissa was operations. The board was oversight. Eleanor was the failure. A mother in the second row began crying before Preston finished. A father shouted that his son had been taken by ambulance, and no one from the school had told him the truth. Another parent demanded to know whether Eleanor had prepared the food herself. Someone else asked why an older cafeteria worker had been allowed to manage children's meals without supervision. The questions did not wait for answers. They came like stones, thrown by people who had been handed a target. Preston let it happen long enough to be useful. Then he raised his hand, not to protect Eleanor, but to appear reasonable while she absorbed the room's fury. He assured the parents that Willowbrook had already placed the employee most closely connected to lunch service on administrative leave. He promised that further action would be taken if negligence was confirmed. He did not mention Eleanor's memo. He did not mention the supplier change. He did not mention that the salad had been questioned before service. He did not mention that Eleanor had been the one to organize the children by symptoms, while everyone else panicked. Marissa sat very still. That was how Eleanor knew she was frightened. People like Marissa moved constantly when they felt safe. They adjusted tablets, touched folders, corrected chairs, polished appearances. But fear had made her quiet. Her eyes kept sliding toward Eleanor's apron pocket, where the notebook rested beneath the faded cloth. The whole room believed Eleanor's silence was weakness. Marissa knew better. She knew Eleanor had written things down. Hannah Morrison was in the third row. Eleanor had seen her before the meeting began, sitting with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Caleb was still in the hospital, stable but weak. His breathing improved but not yet normal. Hannah looked smaller than she had at morning drop-off, as if one night of terror had taken weight from her bones. When her eyes met Eleanor's, there was pain in them, but not the same kind of hatred Eleanor saw on other faces. Hannah was a nurse's aide. She knew enough about emergencies to have heard something in the hospital reports that did not fit the story the school was telling. But knowing something does not always give a person the courage to say it in a room full of power. So Hannah looked away. Eleanor did not blame her. The meeting might have ended there if Preston had not grown too confident. He had planned to present concern, promise investigation, and leave Eleanor suspended in public suspicion long enough for the board to manage the story. But anger, once gathered, demands a sacrifice. A father stood and said that leave was not enough. Another parent demanded that Eleanor apologize. Someone else used the word criminal, and the room seized on it because fear loves language that makes uncertainty feel resolved. Preston hesitated, only for a moment. Then he looked toward the school attorney, then toward Marissa, and made a choice that revealed him more clearly than any confession could have. He asked Eleanor to address the families, not to defend herself properly, not to present evidence, not to explain the warning. He invited her to express remorse for the pain the community was experiencing. It was a careful phrase, polished enough to look humane and sharp enough to cut. If Eleanor apologized, they would treat it like guilt. If she refused, they would call her cold. Every parent turned toward her. For the first time that day, Eleanor felt the full weight of being old, poor, and alone in a room that had already chosen its version of events. Her hands remained folded, but inside one palm, her fingers pressed against the edge of the notebook through her apron. She thought of the children. She thought of the sealed bag hidden in the refrigerator. She thought of Caleb's airway narrowing beneath her hands. She thought of the memo she had written and the way important people had ignored it because her uniform made her easy to dismiss. She did not apologize for a thing she had not done, but she did speak. She spoke slowly, in the kind of voice that made the nearest rows quiet without knowing why. She did not accuse. She did not dramatize. She did not explain her nursing history or plead for respect. She said, in essence, that the children deserved the truth more than they deserved a fast answer. She said the food should not have been served. She said she had warned the appropriate staff. She said the sick children had not all eaten the same portions, and that distinction mattered. She said the records in her notebook were meant to help doctors, not protect herself. A few parents stopped shouting, not because they believed her yet, but because truth sometimes has a different rhythm than performance. Preston felt that shift and stepped in quickly. He reminded the room that official investigators would determine facts and that unverified claims from an employee under review should not distract from the school's process. The word process did heavy work for him. It sounded responsible while burying the fact that his process had begun with hiding the woman who knew the timeline best. Marissa stood then, unable to sit still any longer. She spoke about standardized supply checks, approved vendors, and the importance of not spreading misinformation during a crisis. She suggested that the kitchen had experienced confusion because certain staff members resisted updated procedures. She did not say Eleanor's name every time, but she did not need to. Every sentence pointed like a finger. That was when the school nurse finally looked up. Her name was Diane Mercer, and until that moment, she had seemed folded into herself. Eleanor watched her eyes move from Marissa to the sealed trays, then to the parents, then down to her own hands. Diane had been trained to care for children, but institutions have a way of teaching caring people to fear paperwork more than danger. Eleanor knew that fear. She had seen it in hospitals too. A person does not always become complicit because she is cruel. Sometimes she becomes complicit because she believes the truth will cost her job, and her job is the only way she feeds her family. Diane did not speak in that meeting, but she began to cry. It was small, controlled, nearly hidden. Yet Eleanor saw it, and Marissa saw Eleanor seeing it. After the meeting, the room did not empty so much as break apart. Parents clustered in angry groups. Reporters outside the doors tried to catch anyone willing to speak. Board members vanished behind administrators. Preston moved through the gym like a shepherd of damage, placing hands on shoulders, promising updates, making grief feel attended to while guiding it safely away from himself. Eleanor was escorted toward a side hallway. Marissa followed. There were no parents here, no cameras, no board members. The hallway smelled of varnish and old basketballs. Sunlight came through a narrow window high on the wall. In that smaller space, Marissa's politeness fell away like a costume she was tired of wearing. She told Eleanor that the notebook needed to be turned over immediately. She said investigators would view the refusal badly. She said the school could not guarantee support for an employee who appeared to be withholding relevant information. Support. The word almost made Eleanor smile. Willowbrook had placed her before a room full of furious parents, implied her guilt, locked her out of her own kitchen, and begun rewriting the incident before the children had fully recovered. Now, Marissa was offering support in exchange for the only record she had not controlled. Eleanor kept the notebook. Marissa's face hardened. She warned that old notes made in panic could be misunderstood. She suggested Eleanor might not remember the timeline correctly. She mentioned age without saying the word too directly. She implied confusion, fatigue, emotional distress, all the soft weapons used against older women when their clarity becomes inconvenient. Eleanor had heard every version before. In hospitals, patients were called confused when they were inconvenient. Mothers were called hysterical when they were right. Nurses were called difficult when they noticed the doctor had missed something. People in authority rarely admitted they feared truth. They called it disorder. So Eleanor left with the notebook still in her pocket. By that evening, her name was everywhere. Not in the way a name is honored, in the way a name is dragged. Local news referred to her as the cafeteria worker at the center of the Willowbrook food crisis. Social media did what social media always did when given fear, a photograph, and no patience. Parents shared old pictures from school events, zooming in on Eleanor behind lunch tables, as if her faded uniform had always been evidence of danger. Strangers who had never met her wrote that schools should not trust low-level workers with children's food. One post claimed she had been careless for years. Another suggested she had probably been hiding health problems. People who knew nothing spoke with the confidence of those who would never have to repair what they damaged. Eleanor sat at her small kitchen table that night, with the television off and the notebook open in front of her. Her house was modest, narrow, and quiet. The wallpaper had faded near the window. A kettle sat on the stove. On one shelf were framed photographs from a life Willowbrook had never asked about. Eleanor in blue scrubs beside other nurses at St. Agnes. Eleanor holding a certificate for 20 years of emergency service. Eleanor with her late husband at a picnic. Eleanor standing beside a young girl whose name she still could not say, without feeling the old wound move. None of those pictures mattered to the people calling her careless. They had seen a hairnet and decided that was the whole story. She copied her notebook pages onto clean paper in case the original disappeared. Old habits, hospital habits. Never keep only one record when someone powerful wants the record gone. The next morning, the health department arrived at Willowbrook. Eleanor was not allowed inside during the inspection. She waited across the street near the bus stop, watching men and women in plain coats enter through the cafeteria loading door. Marissa greeted them with professional concern. Preston stood nearby, speaking gravely. The sealed trays from the gymnasium were carried out. The refrigerator was opened. The trash bins had already been emptied the day before. The hidden bag was gone. Eleanor knew before anyone told her. There are losses a person feels in the body before evidence confirms them. The sealed bag she had placed behind the older milk crates, the one with the strange chemical smell, the one thing that might have tied the symptoms directly to the supplier, had disappeared. Later, when an investigator asked whether she had preserved any physical sample, Eleanor described where it had been placed. The investigator checked. Nothing. The maintenance notice was gone too. Marissa had cleaned the corner. Powerful people forgot only after realizing Eleanor had remembered it. That should have broken her. Instead, it made something inside Eleanor settle. By trying to erase the evidence, Marissa had confirmed there was evidence worth erasing. The hospital became the place where the truth began to breathe again. Caleb Morrison woke more fully on the second day. His voice was weak. His throat hurt. His mother sat beside him with circles under her eyes, and one hand resting lightly on his blanket, as if she feared that if she stopped touching him, the world might take him again. A pediatric specialist explained reactions, exposure, and the need for follow-up testing. The language was careful, medical, incomplete. But Caleb, in the simple, broken way children remember terror, said enough to make Hannah go still. He remembered Eleanor telling him not to take the salad. He remembered her putting a safe fruit cup on his tray instead. He remembered a teacher hurrying the line. He remembered the lady from the office telling Eleanor that lunch had to keep moving. Most importantly, he remembered Eleanor kneeling beside him when he could not breathe, telling the adults what medicine he needed before anyone else could find the form. Hannah did not know the whole truth yet, but she knew enough to understand that the woman being blamed on the news had not behaved like the source of danger. She had behaved like the only adult who knew what danger looked like. That night, Hannah called the school nurse. Diane Mercer did not answer at first. She let the call go to voicemail. Then guilt did what fear had failed to do, and she called back from her car in the parking lot of a grocery store, where no one from Willowbrook could overhear her. Hannah told her what Caleb remembered. Diane listened, crying before the story ended. Then Diane admitted what she had not been brave enough to say in the gym. Eleanor had come to her with concerns days before the incident. Diane had forwarded them to administration. She had asked whether the new supplier should be reviewed. The answer had come back wrapped in polite dismissal. Food service compliance was being handled by operations. No further action was necessary. Staff should avoid creating unnecessary alarm. Unnecessary alarm. That was what they had called the warning before the ambulances came. Hannah asked if Diane would say that publicly. Diane did not answer quickly. Fear returned, practical and heavy. A job, insurance, children of her own, a mortgage. The machinery of silence is rarely built from evil alone. Often it is built from ordinary needs pressed against a powerful institution. But by the end of the call, Diane agreed to do one thing. She would look for the email trail. If it still existed, she would save it somewhere safe. The first crack appeared. The second came from a student no one had thought to notice. Her name was Lena Ortiz, a sophomore in Willowbrook's media club. She was quiet, observant, and more comfortable behind cameras than in front of people. She had been working on a student documentary about the hidden workers of the school, a project her advisor had approved because it sounded harmless and wholesome. The janitors, the groundskeeper, the cafeteria staff, the bus drivers, the people who made Willowbrook function while the school's public image centered on donors, administrators, and award-winning students. Lena had interviewed Eleanor the week before the poisoning. Not a formal interview. Eleanor had not liked the idea of being filmed, but Lena had set up small cameras in the service hallway to capture background footage of the cafeteria opening before lunch. She wanted to show hands preparing food, trays being arranged, the rhythm of work most students never saw. One camera had been mounted above the service hall near the loading entrance, old equipment borrowed from the media closet, connected to a portable drive because the school's main system was unreliable there. After the poisoning, Marissa ordered all student media related to the cafeteria deleted until the investigation ended. Lena obeyed at first. She was 15. Institutions count on that. They count on young people believing obedience is the same as goodness. She deleted the project folder from the media club computer while her hands shook. She told herself it was not her place. She told herself adults knew what they were doing. She told herself the footage was probably unimportant. Then she saw Eleanor on the news, not the Eleanor who had spoken to her about how some children were too proud to admit they were hungry, not the woman who had laughed softly when Lena asked why she wrote names in a notebook. The news showed Eleanor as a suspect, a gray-haired cafeteria worker under investigation. It used a picture cropped from a school event where Eleanor stood in the background, half blurred, half accused. Something about that made Lena sick. So she checked the backup drive. The deleted folder was gone from the computer, but the camera had saved raw files onto the portable drive before syncing. Lena found hours of ordinary footage first. Empty hallway, delivery carts, Eleanor wiping counters, staff moving in and out, nothing dramatic. Then she found the morning of the poisoning. At first, she did not understand what she was seeing. There was no sound in part of the footage, only movement. Eleanor at the loading door, opening a crate, pausing. Eleanor calling over another staff member. Eleanor setting aside several bags. Marissa entering the frame. The two women facing each other near the prep table. Marissa's posture sharp. Eleanor standing still. Then Marissa pointing toward the lunch line. A staff member reluctantly lifting the bags Eleanor had set aside. Trays moving forward. Lena watched it 3 times. On the 4th viewing, she noticed something else. A second camera from the side hallway had captured audio in fragments. Not enough for every word. Enough for meaning. Eleanor's voice was low, warning that the greens smelled wrong and should not be served. Marissa's voice was clearer, impatient, saying the inspection was already approved and lunch could not be disrupted because visitors were on campus. The exact words were broken by kitchen noise, but the shape of the truth survived. Lena sat alone in the media room long after school ended, staring at the screen, while the building settled into evening creaks around her. She was 15 years old, and she understood enough to be afraid. Because the footage did not only prove Eleanor had warned them, it proved the school had lied after children got sick. Lena tried to tell her media advisor first. Mr. Alvarez was a good teacher, tired in the way good teachers often are when they work in places that celebrate student voice only until it becomes inconvenient. He watched the footage without speaking. His face changed slowly, the way a person's face changes when the safe choice and the right choice move in opposite directions. He told Lena not to upload anything. She thought he was choosing the school. Then he took the portable drive, made 2 copies, gave one back to her, and told her to go straight home. His hands were shaking when he did it. That frightened her, more than if he had shouted. Adults only tremble around truth when they know it can cost them something. By the next morning, Willowbrook's story was beginning to fray, though Preston Vale did not know it yet. He was preparing the final version. The board wanted closure. The donor families wanted reassurance. The health department was moving too slowly for the school's public relations team. Parents were angry, but anger without direction could turn upward, if not carefully managed. Preston needed a decisive act, something that made Willowbrook look strong, not cruel. Strong, accountable, protective. So he scheduled an emergency board meeting and invited selected parents. The agenda was not sent to Eleanor, but she learned of it through Diane Mercer, who called from a number Eleanor did not recognize, and spoke with the fragile urgency of a woman trying to do the right thing before fear talked her out of it. Diane had found the emails, Eleanor's memo, Diane's forwarded concern, Marissa's dismissal. Preston copied on the thread. It was not everything, but it was enough to show the warning had not disappeared. Hannah Morrison called next. Her voice was different from the one Eleanor remembered from the lunch line. Harder, yes, but not against Eleanor anymore, against the lie. Caleb had repeated the same memory to a doctor, and the doctor had documented it. Hannah did not ask Eleanor whether she had saved her son. She said she knew. Those words nearly undid Eleanor. Not because she needed praise. Praise had always made her uncomfortable. It was simply the first time since the gymnasium that someone had looked at the truth and not turned away. Still, Eleanor knew pieces were not enough. A child's memory could be challenged. Emails could be explained away. A notebook could be dismissed. People like Preston and Marissa had spent their lives turning evidence into uncertainty whenever certainty threatened them. Then Mr. Alvarez came to her house. He arrived after dark, rain shining on his jacket, holding a small padded envelope like it contained something heavier than plastic and wires. Lena waited in his car, visible through the windshield, her face pale and determined. Mr. Alvarez did not make a speech. He did not pretend bravery felt clean. He admitted that he had almost stayed silent. He admitted that Willowbrook could ruin a teacher quietly, without ever using the word punishment. Then he placed the envelope on Eleanor's kitchen table. Inside was the drive. Eleanor did not watch the footage right away. She simply looked at it. This small, ordinary object that had survived deletion, obedience, panic, and the arrogance of people who believed anything not under their control did not matter. The truth had been recorded by a child trying to make a school project about invisible workers. There was a kind of justice in that so precise, it almost hurt. The emergency board meeting was set for the following afternoon. Preston believed it would end with Eleanor's termination, a carefully worded apology to parents, and a promise of improved oversight. Marissa believed the missing food sample and cleaned kitchen had removed the worst of her risk. The board believed money could repair reputation if blame was assigned quickly enough. None of them knew that Hannah Morrison would be there with Caleb's documented statement. None of them knew Diane Mercer had saved the email chain. None of them knew Lena Ortiz had kept a second copy. And none of them knew that Eleanor May Carter, the lunch lady they had blamed for poisoning children, would walk into that boardroom not with anger, not with revenge, but with the calm of a woman who had spent her life reading vital signs and knew exactly when a failing body was about to reveal the truth. By the time Eleanor May Carter arrived at the emergency board meeting, Willowbrook Academy had already prepared the ending it wanted. The conference room had been arranged with the quiet elegance of an institution trying to look calm while standing beside a fire it had helped start. A long, polished table ran through the center of the room. Water glasses had been placed in front of every leather chair. Folders were stacked neatly at each seat, filled with carefully chosen summaries, legal language, parent updates, and a draft statement that no one had shown Eleanor. Through the tall windows, the campus looked almost peaceful. Children moved between buildings, under the watch of teachers pretending the world had not shifted beneath them. The stone walkways were clean. The flower beds were trimmed. The front of Willowbrook still looked like a place where nothing ugly could survive. But truth does not care how polished a table is. Eleanor stood near the end of that room, in her same faded cafeteria uniform. She had been told she could attend, because the matter concerned her employment. But the chair reserved for her had been placed away from the board members, away from the school attorney, and away from the center of conversation. It was the same strategy they had used in the gymnasium, only quieter. Put the woman apart. Make her look like the problem instead of the witness. Let wealth, titles, and architecture do what accusation could not. Principal Preston Vale sat at the head of the table with his hands folded, his expression solemn but controlled. Marissa Lang sat to his right, wearing a pale blouse and the brittle confidence of someone who had spent the night convincing herself the worst evidence had disappeared. Board members murmured to one another in low voices. A few selected parents had been invited, though invited was too generous a word for what had happened. The parents chosen were those the school believed could be managed: donors, alumni, people who knew the value of discretion, people who understood that reputation was a kind of currency. But Hannah Morrison was there too. That had not been part of Preston's plan. She sat near the far side of the room, with a hospital bracelet still around her wrist from staying beside Caleb. She looked exhausted, but exhaustion had burned away her fear. The night before, she had listened to her son describe Eleanor's hands, Eleanor's voice, Eleanor's instructions, and the safe fruit cup that had been placed on his tray. A mother could misunderstand many things in grief, but she could not misunderstand the moment her child told her who had tried to protect him. Diane Mercer, the school nurse, sat 2 seats away from Hannah with a folder clutched in her lap. Her face was pale, but she had come. That alone mattered. Fear had kept her silent in the gym, but shame had followed her home, sat with her through the night, and refused to leave. By morning, she had printed the emails, saved them twice, and understood that silence was no longer self-protection. It was participation. Near the back of the room stood Mr. Alvarez from the media department. Beside him was Lena Ortiz, a 15-year-old student with anxious eyes and a backpack held tightly in front of her. She had not been invited either, not officially. But truth often enters important rooms through doors no one thought to lock. Preston began the meeting with sorrow. That was always his first move. He thanked the board, the parents, the school staff, and the health officials for their cooperation. He spoke of the children still recovering, of the emotional difficulty facing the Willowbrook community, of the need for decisive action. He never said Eleanor's name at first. He did not need to. Everyone in the room knew where the sentence was headed before it arrived. The school attorney then summarized the internal review in language polished enough to hide its emptiness. There had been inconsistencies in cafeteria procedure. There had been concerns regarding documentation. There had been an employee who had acted outside proper channels during and after the incident. No one at the table said the word scapegoat, but that was the shape of every sentence. Eleanor could hear the machinery turning. It was not looking for truth. It was building a bridge away from liability. Then Preston finally looked at her. He spoke with sadness in his voice, as if firing her would hurt him more than it hurt the woman whose name had been dragged across the news. He said Willowbrook had a duty to restore trust. He said the school could not move forward, while serious questions remained about the conduct of its food service staff. He said the board would be asked to approve Eleanor May Carter's termination, effective immediately, while further legal questions were handled through appropriate channels. There it was, the ending they had written for her. Eleanor did not move. She had spent enough years in emergency rooms to know that some moments required stillness. Panic wasted oxygen. Anger blurred the edges of useful detail. In a crisis, one had to listen past the noise and wait for the vital sign that mattered. The first vital sign came from Hannah Morrison. Her voice was not loud, but it changed the room because it carried the weight of a mother who had almost lost her son. She asked whether the board had reviewed Caleb's hospital statement. Preston's face tightened slightly, then relaxed into concern. He said the school respected all family experiences and would cooperate fully with medical documentation. It was an answer designed to sound complete while saying nothing. Hannah did not let it pass. She explained that Caleb remembered Eleanor warning him away from the salad. He remembered her giving him a safe fruit cup. He remembered her recognizing his breathing trouble before anyone else understood what was happening. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Powerful people rarely shift dramatically when their version of events is threatened. They adjust posture. They glance at attorneys. They look down at papers they have already read. But Eleanor saw it. The certainty around the table had lost its first layer. Marissa responded before Preston could. She suggested that children recovering from medical distress could remember events imperfectly. She said Caleb had been frightened. She said the school could not build conclusions around a child's fragmented memory. Her tone was careful, almost sympathetic, but the meaning was cold. Caleb's memory was useful when the school needed parents' fear. It became unreliable the moment it pointed away from Eleanor. That was when Diane Mercer opened her folder. She did not look like a brave woman in that moment. Brave people in stories often stand tall, speak clearly, and appear transformed. Real bravery is messier. Diane's fingers trembled. Her voice caught at first. She looked as if every sentence had to pass through the weight of her mortgage, her job, and the children she supported before it could reach the room. But she spoke anyway. She confirmed that Eleanor had raised concerns before the poisoning. She confirmed that Eleanor had documented symptoms and supplier concerns. She confirmed that Eleanor's memo had been forwarded to administration, including Marissa Lang and Principal Vale. She explained that she had been told not to create unnecessary alarm. Unnecessary alarm. The words hung in the room with a cruelty that needed no embellishment. For the first time, Preston stopped looking sorrowful and began looking careful. Marissa's face lost color. The school attorney leaned toward the principal and whispered something behind one hand. A board member asked whether the email chain existed. Diane placed printed copies on the table. Eleanor watched the papers move from hand to hand. They were not dramatic. They did not glow with justice. They were simply printed emails, black ink on white paper. But sometimes the plainest evidence is the most dangerous because it refuses to be turned into metaphor. There were dates, there were names, there were warnings, there was acknowledgement, there was dismissal. Preston tried to regain the room. He thanked Diane for clarifying the timeline and suggested the emails would be reviewed in the proper context. He said staff concerns were often evaluated alongside vendor certifications, budgetary needs, and professional compliance standards. The words were smooth, but they no longer landed the same way. Once a lie has cracked, every polished sentence sounds like someone stepping around broken glass. Then Mr. Alvarez stepped forward. Preston looked genuinely irritated now. Not frightened yet. Irritated. A media teacher and a student were not supposed to matter in a boardroom filled with donors, attorneys, and administrators. They belonged to the softer parts of the school, the parts used for brochures and student showcases, not institutional survival. But Mr. Alvarez placed a small drive on the table, and for the first time that day, Marissa looked truly afraid. He explained that, as part of a student documentary project, cameras had been recording in the cafeteria service hallway on the morning of the incident. He explained that the footage had been ordered deleted after the crisis. He explained that a backup existed. No one spoke for several seconds. It was one thing to deny memory. It was another to deny a camera. Marissa said immediately that any unauthorized recording would violate school policy. The speed of her response betrayed her. She had not asked what was on the footage. She had not asked whether it might help the children. She had reached first for policy, the favorite shield of people who fear evidence more than misconduct. Lena Ortiz spoke then, not loudly, but clearly enough for every adult in the room to hear. She explained that the project had been approved. The camera placement had been approved. The hallway had been used only to film cafeteria operations for a student feature about workers whose labor often went unseen. She looked toward Eleanor only once, and in that glance was an apology too heavy for a 15-year-old to carry. Eleanor wanted to tell her she had done enough, more than enough. But this was not the moment. The board chair ordered the footage played. Preston objected through the attorney. The attorney suggested a private review. Hannah insisted that the parents deserved to see what the school had already tried to hide. Diane placed her printed emails beside the drive. Mr. Alvarez connected the file to the room's display system with hands steadier than his face. The screen lit up. At first, the footage looked ordinary. A cafeteria service hallway before lunch, delivery crates near the loading door, staff moving in and out. Eleanor entering the frame in her faded uniform, carrying no authority anyone at Willowbrook had ever respected. She opened a crate. She paused. She leaned closer. Even without sound, the room could see the moment her body understood something was wrong. Then the second camera angle appeared, with broken audio. Eleanor's voice came through low and grainy, warning that the green smelled wrong and should not be served. Kitchen noise swallowed some words, but not enough. Marissa entered the frame. Her posture was sharp. Her voice carried more clearly than Eleanor's, telling staff that lunch could not be disrupted, that the supplier had been approved, and that visitors were on campus. The room watched Eleanor set several bags aside. Then they watched a staff member, after Marissa's order, move some of them back toward service. Hannah covered her mouth. Diane began to cry again, but this time she did not lower her head. Preston's face had gone still, in the way faces go still when every expression becomes dangerous. The footage continued. The first child became sick, then another. The camera did not capture every table, but it captured enough of the service area to show confusion spreading. Teachers moved without direction. Staff looked toward administrators who were not there. Then Eleanor re-entered the frame, and the room changed as it watched her. She was not panicking. She was not hiding. She was not acting like someone who had caused harm and wished to escape it. She moved with purpose. She pointed staff toward certain tables. She separated trays. She sent someone toward the nurse's office. She took notes. She looked at children's faces, not as a cafeteria worker guessing, but as a medical professional reading symptoms. When Caleb appeared at the edge of the footage, small and struggling, Eleanor reached him before the adults around him understood what his body was saying. The audio caught fragments, enough to hear her instruct someone to call emergency services, enough to hear her identify breathing trouble, enough to hear her ask for Caleb's medication, enough to hear her keeping her voice steady when everyone else was beginning to unravel. In that boardroom, the word lunch lady began to collapse under the weight of what it had failed to see. The footage ended after the ambulances arrived. No one moved. There are silences that feel empty, and there are silences that feel full of things finally becoming undeniable. This was the second kind. Every person in the room had entered with a story ready to accept. Eleanor had been careless. Eleanor had failed. Eleanor had poisoned the children. The footage did not merely dispute that story. It reversed it so completely that the old accusation seemed obscene. The board chair asked Eleanor why she had not told them she was trained. It was a strange question, though Eleanor understood why he asked it. People with titles believe credentials are only real when displayed. They assume a person without a framed certificate on the wall must not have a history worth considering. Eleanor explained, quietly and without self-pity, that she had been an emergency nurse for 27 years before coming to Willowbrook. She had not hidden it, because she was ashamed. She had simply never been asked. The school had seen a uniform and decided that was all it needed to know. That truth landed harder than accusation. Preston tried to apologize in the language of damage control. He said the school clearly needed to review its internal communication. He said mistakes had been made. He said emotions had run high. He began building a fog before the fire could reach him. But Hannah Morrison would not allow fog. She asked who had changed suppliers. She asked who ignored the memo. She asked who ordered student footage deleted. She asked why the cafeteria was locked before Eleanor could retrieve evidence. She asked whether the missing sealed food sample had been logged. With every question, Marissa grew smaller. Then Eleanor spoke again. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She explained that after the children became sick, she had preserved one sealed bag of the greens in the back of the refrigerator. She had done so because she believed investigators would need it. The next morning, after the cafeteria was locked, the bag was gone. No one had told her where it went. That was the moment Marissa Lang lost the room. Not because anyone had proven exactly what she had done yet, but because her fear became visible. She denied touching anything. Then she said many people had access. Then she said the kitchen had to be sanitized. Then she claimed she did not recall specific handling of materials during a crisis. Each answer contradicted the shape of the one before it. Truth has a gravity of its own. Once it begins pulling, lies cannot keep their balance. The board ordered an immediate preservation of all vendor records, communication logs, cleaning schedules, and supplier contracts. The attorney who had arrived ready to manage Eleanor now began advising the board to protect itself from Preston and Marissa. That was when Preston understood he was no longer the shepherd of the crisis. He was part of the flock being counted. Over the next hour, the hidden structure came apart. Marissa had pushed through the new supplier over objections from cafeteria staff. The vendor had offered significant cost reductions during a year when the board wanted to delay tuition increases. A consulting fee connected to the vendor had been routed through a small company tied to Marissa's brother-in-law. Preston had approved the arrangement without proper independent review because the savings helped support his expansion campaign and donor presentation. The food safety documents were not entirely false, but they were incomplete, outdated, and treated as sufficient by people who benefited from not looking harder. No one had intended children to be hurt. That was the defense Marissa tried to hide behind. Eleanor had heard that defense before, in hospitals, in lawsuits, in whispered hallway conversations after preventable harm. No one meant for this to happen. As if harm only counted when someone woke up and chose it directly. But children had still been placed in danger. Warnings had still been ignored. Evidence had still been removed. An innocent woman had still been offered to grieving parents as the price of protecting an institution's shine. Intent did not erase consequence. By evening, Preston Vale had been placed on administrative leave. Marissa Lang was escorted from campus, while the board contacted outside counsel and health authorities. The supplier contract was suspended. The missing food sample became part of a formal investigation. Diane's emails, Lena's footage, Hannah's statement, and Eleanor's notebook were all turned over to investigators. But this time, copies remained in hands Willowbrook could not control. The next morning, the school issued a public correction. It was not enough. Public corrections rarely are. They arrive after the damage has already run through a person's life. But it mattered. Willowbrook acknowledged that Eleanor May Carter had warned staff before lunch service that she had acted during the emergency to protect students, and that statements implying her responsibility had been premature and deeply wrong. The local news that had once displayed her photo beneath suspicion now had to say her name beside the word saved. Parents who had shouted in the gym began sending apologies. Some were sincere, some were embarrassed, some were written with the careful discomfort of people asking forgiveness without wanting to look too closely at why they had believed the worst so quickly. Eleanor read them all and answered very few. Forgiveness, she knew, was not the same thing as allowing people to skip understanding. The parents had been afraid, yes, but fear had not forced them to look down instead of up. They had chosen the easiest target because the school had placed her in front of them. Hannah Morrison came to see her in person. She brought Caleb with her once he was strong enough. He was thinner, still tired, but smiling shyly behind his round glasses. Eleanor had prepared a small container of safe cookies, though she made him check the label himself because trust should never mean surrendering caution. Hannah tried to apologize and thank her in the same breath, and both words broke under the weight of what could have happened. Eleanor accepted the thanks more easily than the apology, not because she was hard, but because she understood that Hannah's mistake had come from fear, while the school's had come from calculation. Caleb gave Eleanor a drawing. It showed the cafeteria, a tray, and a woman with gray hair standing between a child and a dark scribble labeled danger in a 7-year-old's uneven hand. Eleanor placed it on her refrigerator at home, beside old photographs from St. Agnes. For the first time in years, the memory of the child she had not been able to save did not stand alone in her heart. It stood beside Caleb, beside the children who had gone home alive, beside the terrible truth that grief and purpose can sometimes live in the same room. Willowbrook changed because it had to. Not because institutions become moral after one meeting, but because evidence makes denial expensive. The board hired an independent food safety auditor. All vendor contracts were reviewed publicly. The cafeteria staff gained authority to halt service if safety concerns arose. The school nurse's office received funding it had requested for years. Every staff member, from teachers to administrators, was required to complete emergency response training. The media club's project about invisible workers became mandatory viewing for new families, though Eleanor insisted her interview be shortened. She had never wanted to be turned into a symbol while still carrying trays. Preston Vale resigned before the investigation concluded. His public statement spoke of taking responsibility for the community's healing, but no one who had watched him in that boardroom mistook resignation for courage. Marissa faced legal consequences tied to the vendor arrangement and the missing sample. The supplier became the subject of a broader investigation after other schools quietly came forward with complaints they had been too embarrassed to admit. That was the poetic justice of it. Preston had built his image on protecting children, and he lost his position because he protected reputation instead. Marissa had treated safety as a line item, and her own paperwork became the chain that pulled her down. Willowbrook had tried to make Eleanor look like the weak link in its system, only for the world to see that she had been the one holding the system together when it failed. But Eleanor did not ask for revenge. When the board offered a settlement, she listened politely. When they offered a public ceremony, she declined the first version because it sounded too much like they wanted applause for admitting what they should never have denied. When they asked what she wanted, she gave them a list written in the same careful blue ink she had used in her notebook. Every child at Willowbrook would eat safely, regardless of income. No child would have their meal withheld, marked, or made smaller because of unpaid balances. Food suppliers would be independently inspected. Cafeteria workers would have the authority to stop service without fear of retaliation. Emergency medical information would be updated and accessible. Scholarship families would not be photographed for brochures unless they were also heard in meetings. And a fund would be created for students pursuing nursing, nutrition, public health, or emergency medicine. The board expected money to be the hard part. It wasn't. The hard part was being told by the woman they had tried to destroy that safety was not a slogan. It was a practice. It was paperwork done correctly when no one was watching. It was listening to the person closest to the problem. It was believing that a cafeteria worker might know something a principal did not. It was understanding that dignity belonged as much in the lunch line as it did in the admissions office. Months later, the cafeteria at Willowbrook looked different. Not expensive. Different in the ways that mattered. The refrigerator worked properly. The loading door had a new inspection station. Ingredient lists were clear. Staff meetings included the people who actually handled the food. Diane Mercer no longer had to beg quietly for emergency updates. Lena's documentary, finished with Eleanor's reluctant permission, won a student journalism award, though Lena cared less about the award than the fact that people finally watched the kitchen without looking through it. Eleanor returned to work on a Monday. She could have retired. Many people told her she should. Some said she deserved rest. Some said the school did not deserve her. Both things were partly true. But Eleanor had learned that healing does not always mean leaving the place where you were wounded. Sometimes healing means returning with new boundaries, with the truth established, with the power to say no and be heard. When she stepped behind the serving counter, the children reacted first. They did not make speeches. Children rarely need speeches when sincerity is available. Caleb waved with both hands. A little girl asked if the soup was safe today, and Eleanor answered with the seriousness the question deserved. A boy from the scholarship program placed his tray down and told her he was glad she came back, then looked embarrassed by his own honesty. Eleanor simply added an extra roll to his plate and moved the line along. The adults were more awkward. Some avoided her eyes. Some thanked her too formally. Some apologized with voices that trembled under the weight of being wrong. Eleanor accepted what she could and let the rest pass. She had no interest in becoming cruel just because cruelty had visited her, but neither did she shrink for their comfort anymore. When a delivery arrived late and the temperature reading looked wrong, she stopped service immediately. This time, no one questioned her. Near the entrance to the cafeteria, the school placed a small plaque after weeks of debate. Eleanor refused every version that called her a hero. She said heroes were too easy for institutions to celebrate and too easy to ignore afterward. Finally, they chose words she allowed. The Carter Student Care Kitchen. Beneath that, in smaller letters, the plaque stated that no child should have to be saved by accident. On the day it was installed, Eleanor stood before it for only a moment. She thought of St. Agnes. She thought of the little boy she had not been able to save years ago, the one whose mother kept apologizing in a voice Eleanor had carried for half her life. She thought of Caleb breathing again. She thought of the children whose names filled her notebook, not as liabilities, not as data, but as lives entrusted to adults who had no right to be careless. Then she went back to work, because that was who Eleanor May Carter was. Not a woman who needed applause, not a woman who wanted revenge, not a woman whose worth began when powerful people finally recognized it. She was a caregiver, and caregivers understand something the world forgets until disaster forces it to remember. Care is not small because it happens quietly. Care is not simple because it happens every day. Care is not less important because it is done by hands wearing gloves, aprons, uniforms, or scars. At the end of that school year, Willowbrook held an assembly very different from the one that had nearly destroyed her. This time, Eleanor was not standing alone beneath bright lights while people decided her guilt. She sat near the front beside Hannah and Caleb, while Diane, Lena, Mr. Alvarez, and several cafeteria workers were recognized for changing the school's safety policies. Eleanor disliked the attention, but she tolerated it because the children were watching, and children needed to see adults admit the truth. When she was asked to speak, she kept it brief. She did not recount every injustice. She did not list every insult. She did not use the moment to humiliate those who had humiliated her. She simply reminded the room that protecting children requires more than good intentions and beautiful words. It requires listening when someone inconvenient raises a warning. It requires respecting the people closest to the work. It requires choosing truth before reputation, not after the cameras arrive. The applause that followed was not the loudest sound Eleanor remembered from Willowbrook. She remembered the first gasp of a child who could not breathe. She remembered the silence in the boardroom when the footage ended. She remembered the soft scratch of her pen as she wrote down times, symptoms, and names, while others were still trying to understand the emergency. Those were the sounds that mattered. Applause fades, records remain, children grow, systems either change or wait for the next crisis to expose them. Years later, people would tell the story in simpler ways. They would say the lunch lady was blamed and then cleared. They would say an old nurse saved the children. They would say the principal fell, the director was punished, and the school learned a lesson. But the real story was not only about one poisoning or one meeting or one hidden video. It was about the danger of judging people by the uniform that makes them useful to you. It was about institutions that call themselves excellent while ignoring the voices that keep them safe. It was about how quickly frightened people will accept a scapegoat if the truth asks them to look at someone powerful. And most of all, it was about a woman who had spent her life noticing what others missed. A strange smell beneath wet greens, a child's lips losing color, a mother too tired to fight alone, a nurse afraid to speak, a student camera blinking red in a forgotten hallway, a system trying to clean away evidence before anyone could ask why the evidence existed. Eleanor May Carter noticed all of it. So remember this, never assume the quietest person in the room knows the least. Never mistake a faded uniform for an empty history. Never believe that the people serving food, cleaning floors, driving buses, answering phones, or standing behind counters are less important than the people giving speeches about leadership. Sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the only one paying attention closely enough to save a life. And if this story made you think of someone whose quiet care was taken for granted, tell us about them in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to remember that dignity does not come from a title. Truth does not need permission from power, and the people we ignore may be the very people holding our children, our communities, and our future safely together. The slap changed everything.
You do not tell me no.
Daniela stood frozen, stunned and deeply hurt, unable to understand why she had been slapped for simply doing her job.
Did anyone see that?
Her badge became a weapon.
People in your position should know better.
She had only followed protocol.
This corridor is restricted. Please return to reception.
Helen knew the truth.
She was helping me.
Vivian's lie found protection.
Get her out of my hospital. I never want to see her here again.
I'll handle it.
No one asked why.
You took my badge, but you never asked if I was hurt.
Silence followed her out.
I am sorry.
Then she called Samuel.
Samuel, they took my badge. They threw me out.
But it had begun earlier. Earlier that day, a chain reaction collision on the interstate had brought more than 20 injured people through the hospital doors in less than an hour. The trauma bays filled first, then the recovery rooms, then every space that could safely hold a patient with monitoring equipment. Nurses were called from outpatient services, surgical recovery, and specialty clinics. Doctors who had expected routine consultations found themselves treating internal bleeding, fractured ribs, head injuries, and terrified children separated from their parents. The hospital was not merely busy, it was stretched to its edge. In the middle of that crisis, Vivian Hollis arrived for a procedure that was never meant to be urgent. Vivian was 61 years old, immaculately dressed, sharply composed, and accustomed to entering rooms as though they had been built for her. Her family name appeared on plaques throughout the city. The Hollis Foundation had funded scholarship programs, museum exhibits, political campaigns, and hospital projects. 3 years earlier, the foundation had pledged several $million to St. Alden for a pediatric expansion that had not yet been completed. To most people in the hospital, Vivian was not just a donor. She was a force. The staff knew that her complaints reached the executive offices faster than emergency calls reached certain departments. They knew she had private contact numbers for members of the board. They knew that when Vivian Hollis was unhappy, someone usually found a way to make the problem disappear. That afternoon, the problem was supposed to be Daniela. Vivian had been scheduled for a minor cosmetic dermatology procedure in the outpatient wing. It was not dangerous. It was not time-sensitive. It could have been performed another day without any risk to her health. But the procedure required a small recovery area, nursing support, and a team that had suddenly been reassigned to patients coming out of emergency surgery. Daniela had been asked to help coordinate the delays. She approached Vivian with the same professionalism she gave every patient. She explained that the hospital was responding to a mass casualty event and that several staff members needed for Vivian's appointment had been pulled into critical care. She assured her that the procedure would be rescheduled quickly and that the medical team would contact her personally once the crisis had stabilized. It should have been a simple explanation. Instead, Vivian stared at Daniela as though she had been personally insulted. At first, Vivian spoke in the controlled, polished tone of someone who wanted to make sure everyone nearby understood that she believed herself to be above the inconvenience. She questioned why a hospital that had accepted millions from her family could not find one nurse and one room for a procedure that had been scheduled weeks earlier. Daniela explained again that patients with life-threatening injuries were being prioritized. That was when Vivian's expression changed. Her words became colder. Her patience became theatrical. She made comments about Daniela's manner, her accent, and the idea that someone in Daniela's position had the authority to tell her no. She did not need to shout at first. Her contempt was sharper when delivered quietly. Daniela had dealt with angry families before. She had been blamed for wait times she could not control, for outcomes she could not change, and for rules she did not create. She understood that fear often made people cruel, but Vivian was not afraid. Vivian was offended. There was a difference. Daniela stayed calm. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply repeated the truth that mattered most. The hospital had limited resources at that moment, and those resources had to go to the patients whose lives depended on them. Vivian seemed almost stunned that the answer did not change. To her, money had always changed answers. When she realized Daniela would not bend, Vivian removed her phone from her handbag and called Graham Mercer. Graham was the chief operating officer of St. Alden Regional. He had spent years building a reputation as a polished administrator who could calm donors, impress board members, and make difficult situations look manageable. He was known for speaking about integrity in public meetings and efficiency in private ones. But inside the hospital, people had learned that his definition of efficiency often depended on who was upset and how much influence that person had. He answered Vivian's call almost immediately. Daniela could hear only fragments of the conversation from where she stood, but she did not need to hear every word to understand what was happening. Vivian's tone was carefully wounded. She described herself as being mistreated. She framed Daniela's refusal to ignore triage rules as disrespect. She suggested that the hospital had forgotten who helped keep its doors open. Within minutes, Graham arrived in person. He did not ask what had happened in the emergency department. He did not ask how many trauma patients had arrived. He did not ask why Daniela had made the decision she did. He looked first at Vivian, then at Daniela, and it became clear that he had already chosen whose version of the story mattered. Graham took Daniela aside and told her that she would be moved temporarily to the 3rd floor. The explanation sounded harmless on the surface. He said the situation had become tense and that it would be better for everyone if Daniela worked somewhere else for the remainder of the shift. But Daniela understood exactly what it was. It was punishment disguised as conflict management. She had followed the hospital's policies. She had protected emergency patients. She had spoken respectfully. Yet Graham was moving her because Vivian Hollis had complained. Daniela considered protesting. She considered asking him to put the order in writing. But a call came through about an elderly patient upstairs who needed assistance, and the emergency department remained overwhelmed. In that moment, she made the choice she always made when things were difficult. She put the patients first. She accepted the transfer and went upstairs. For the next 40 minutes, Daniela worked in the 3rd floor observation unit, helping nurses manage overflow from the emergency department. The patients there were not all critically injured, but many needed monitoring after surgery, after falls, or after sudden medical episodes that could become serious without warning. One of them was Helen Ward. Mrs. Ward was 78 years old and had come to St. Alden after becoming dizzy at home. Her daughter was stuck in traffic after the interstate accident, and Helen had been alone for most of the afternoon. She was frightened, but trying not to show it. Daniela noticed the way the woman kept watching the hallway each time footsteps passed, hoping someone familiar would appear. Daniela took a few extra minutes to explain what the doctors were monitoring. She adjusted the blanket around Helen's shoulders, made sure her call button was within reach, and promised that someone would keep her informed. To Daniela, it was a small act of care. To Helen, was the only moment that day when she felt like more than a chart number. That kindness would matter later. At the time, Daniela had no way of knowing that Vivian Hollis was moving through the same floor, angry that she had not been given the private route and private attention she believed she deserved. Vivian had been offered a quiet waiting area near the outpatient department while her procedure was formally postponed. But waiting was not something she accepted easily. She had left that area on her own, determined to find someone who would make the hospital's inconvenience disappear. A volunteer had told her that a private exit on the 3rd floor could lead more directly to the parking structure. The volunteer did not know that the route required going through a staff-only corridor. Vivian either did not hear the warning or did not care. When she stepped into the restricted hallway, she saw Daniela near Helen Ward's room. To a reasonable person, it would have looked like coincidence. To Vivian, it became proof of a story she had already invented. She saw the nurse who had refused her. She saw the same steady expression that had made her feel powerless downstairs. And in that moment, Vivian decided that Daniela's presence could not possibly be part of her work. It had to be defiance. Daniela noticed Vivian before Vivian spoke. She recognized the sound of expensive heels against the polished hospital floor. She turned and saw the woman standing near the restricted access sign, her face tense with anger. Daniela did not accuse her. She did not make a scene. She simply reminded Vivian that she was in a staff-only area and offered to help her return to the public corridor. That should have ended it. But Vivian had already crossed the line where reason mattered. She began raising her voice. She accused Daniela of following her. She suggested that Daniela had been waiting for a chance to embarrass her again. Her words were loud enough to draw attention from nearby rooms and the nurses' station. Daniela tried to keep the situation contained. She told Vivian that she was assigned to the 3rd floor and had been there since being moved by administration. She said that the hallway was restricted for patient safety and that Vivian needed to leave the area. Vivian did not want an explanation. She wanted a target. She stepped closer. The air in the corridor seemed to change. People began to watch, but no one stepped forward. The orderly with the linens stopped near the wall. A respiratory therapist paused outside a room. Dr. Megan Blake emerged from the charting station with a look of concern, then hesitation. Vivian reached for Daniela's hospital badge. The motion was so sudden that Daniela barely had time to react. Vivian pulled the badge free from its clip, looked at Daniela's name, then held it as though it were proof that she had the right person. She accused Daniela of harassing a donor. She accused her of making threats. She accused her of disrespecting the hospital. None of it was true. Daniela did not shout back. She did not try to grab the badge. She did not even defend herself in the way Vivian seemed to expect. The restraint on Daniela's face only seemed to make Vivian angrier, because there was nothing she could use as evidence of aggression. So she created it. The slap came fast. It was hard enough to turn Daniela's head to the side. Helen Ward saw it from the doorway of her room. Dr. Megan Blake saw it from only a few feet away. The orderly saw it. The respiratory therapist saw it. The nurses near the station saw it. Several people saw the exact moment Vivian became the aggressor. And yet, in the first seconds afterward, no one said a word. Daniela slowly turned back toward Vivian. One hand rose to her cheek, not dramatically, not with anger, but almost as though she needed to confirm what had just happened. Vivian stood there breathing heavily, looking less ashamed than triumphant. She knew what her money had bought her in the past. She knew that people often chose safety over truth. Then Graham Mercer arrived. No one knew who had called him. Perhaps Vivian had done it herself. Perhaps someone at the front desk had already alerted his office. Either way, he appeared with the speed of a man who understood that a powerful donor in distress could become a public relations disaster. He walked into the corridor, took one look at Vivian, and went directly to her. He asked if she was all right. He asked if she needed medical attention. He asked if anyone had made her feel unsafe. He did not ask Daniela why her cheek was red. He did not ask why Vivian was standing in a restricted hallway. He did not ask the people who had witnessed the incident what they had seen. Vivian told Graham that Daniela had confronted her again. She claimed that the nurse had followed her upstairs and behaved aggressively. She implied that she had only reacted because she felt threatened. Graham listened as though every word were already proven. Then he turned to Daniela. His expression was not angry. That would have been easier to understand. It was colder than anger. It was the expression of someone who had decided that one employee's dignity was an acceptable price for protecting a donor relationship. He asked Daniela to hand over her badge. For the first time that day, something inside her seemed to shift. Not because she was guilty, not because she believed anyone had the right to treat her this way, but because she realized the hospital was not even pretending to care about the truth. She handed him the badge. Graham informed her that she was being placed on administrative leave pending review. He did not say that Vivian had struck her. He did not mention witnesses. He did not say an investigation would begin immediately. He used careful language about avoiding further disruption, and preserving the hospital's reputation. Reputation. That was what mattered. Not the nurse who had been assaulted. Not the patients who had watched adults fail them. Not the message sent to every staff member in the hallway who now understood that doing the right thing could cost them their job if the wrong person became offended. Graham instructed Daniela to leave through the employee exit near the parking garage. He said it would be better than walking through the main lobby while the situation was still sensitive. Daniela understood the real reason. He wanted her gone quietly. He wanted Vivian protected from questions. And he wanted the hospital to appear calm, even if calm had to be built on a lie. As Daniela walked toward the back exit, she passed the same people who had watched Vivian strike her. Some looked ashamed. Some looked frightened. Some could not meet her eyes at all. Dr. Megan Blake stood near the nurse's station, holding the patient file so tightly that the edges bent beneath her fingers. She looked like she wanted to say something. Daniela could see it in her face, but Megan remained silent. Lillian Park, the charge nurse on duty, was not in the hallway when the slap happened. She arrived minutes later and saw only the aftermath. Daniela without her badge, Vivian surrounded by administrators, and Graham speaking in the low, controlled tone he used when he wanted people to stop asking questions. Lillian had worked at St. Alden for more than 20 years. She had watched Graham reward obedience and punish resistance. She had seen nurses move to undesirable shifts after speaking too openly in meetings. She had seen staff members blamed for problems created by budget cuts. She had learned to protect herself by staying careful. But when she saw Daniela walking toward the employee exit with one hand pressed lightly against her cheek, something in Lillian's carefully built silence began to crack. Daniela did not cry in the hallway. She waited until she reached the parking garage. Outside, the late afternoon sun had started to fade behind the city buildings. Ambulances still arrived at the emergency entrance on the other side of the hospital. From where Daniela stood, she could hear distant sirens and the faint hum of traffic. Life was continuing as though nothing had happened. Her phone felt heavy in her hand. For several minutes, she did not call anyone. She sat in her car without starting it, staring at the badge clip still attached to her uniform, even though the badge itself had been taken away. That small, empty piece of plastic seemed to say everything. 8 years of loyalty reduced to an absence. Eventually, she called Samuel Reed. Samuel was not a politician. He was not a lawyer. He was not someone who enjoyed using his title to intimidate people. He was a physician, the director of emergency services for Horizon Medical Alliance, one of the largest regional health systems in the state. He had spent most of his career working in emergency medicine, where decisions had to be made quickly, and where the difference between arrogance and competence could mean the difference between life and death. He understood pressure. He understood grief. He understood that hospitals could be flawed places run by people who were too tired, too ambitious, or too afraid. But when Daniela told him what had happened, he did not interrupt her with promises of revenge. He listened. She told him about Vivian's appointment. She told him about the interstate accident. She told him how Graham had moved her because Vivian was angry. She told him about the restricted hallway, the stolen badge, the slap, the silence, and the order to leave through the back. By the time she finished, Samuel was quiet for a long moment. He knew Daniela well enough to understand that she would not exaggerate. She was not someone who turned every insult into a crisis. She had spent years standing up for patients without making herself the center of the story. So when she said she had been treated like a criminal for following triage rules, he believed her. But Samuel also knew something Daniela was too hurt to think about at that moment. The next morning, he was scheduled to visit St. Alden Regional as part of Horizon's preliminary evaluation of a possible merger. Horizon had been considering whether to bring St. Alden into its network, a move that could mean new equipment, expanded trauma services, financial stability, and access to a larger regional system. St. Alden wanted that merger badly. Graham Mercer wanted it badly too. Samuel did not tell Daniela that he would use the visit to punish anyone. He did not promise that Vivian would regret what she had done. He did not suggest that his title could erase the humiliation Daniela had suffered. Instead, he reminded her of something she had told countless patients and families over the years. When the truth matters, details matter. He encouraged her to write down everything while it was fresh. The timeline, the names of witnesses, the location, the words Graham used, the fact that Vivian had entered a restricted corridor, the fact that Daniela had been transferred to that floor by Graham himself, the fact that no one had asked her for a statement before taking her badge. Daniela spent most of the night doing exactly that. She wrote slowly at first, then more steadily. The more she recorded, the clearer the pattern became. This was not only about one woman losing her temper. It was about a hospital administrator who had chosen a donor over a nurse before the assault had even happened. By midnight, Daniela had completed a formal complaint. She included no dramatic language, no insults, no threats, only facts. The next morning, Graham Mercer arrived at St. Alden, expecting to host an important meeting with Horizon Medical Alliance. He expected polished presentations, financial projections, and conversations about expansion. He expected to emphasize the hospital's strong community reputation and the promise of the pediatric wing the Hollis Foundation might help complete. Instead, he found Samuel Reed standing in the executive conference room. For a brief moment, Graham did not recognize him. Then he saw the name card on the table, and his face changed. Samuel was not there as Daniela's fiancé, at least not officially. He was there as Horizon's Director of Emergency Services and a senior member of the clinical evaluation team. Graham greeted him with the smooth confidence of an administrator who believed he still controlled the room. But Samuel's manner was different from what Graham expected. He was polite, professional, and calm. He asked about trauma capacity, staffing ratios, patient safety reporting, and the hospital's policies for protecting employees from workplace violence. At first, Graham answered as though the questions were routine. Then Samuel asked how St. Alden handled incidents in which staff members reported being assaulted by patients, visitors, or donors. The room became still. Graham gave the standard answer. He spoke about zero tolerance. He mentioned reporting procedures, security protocols, and employee support services. Samuel listened without reacting. Then he asked whether those procedures had been followed the previous afternoon. Graham's confidence began to fade. He did not yet know the full extent of Daniela's complaint. He did not know how much Samuel knew. He did not know whether the matter had already reached Horizon's legal and ethics teams. But he understood one thing. The nurse he had sent out through the back exit was not going to disappear quietly. And somewhere inside the hospital, in a corridor filled with cameras no one had bothered to review, the truth was waiting. The truth did not arrive at St. Alden Regional Hospital all at once. It came in pieces. First, it came through Daniela's written complaint, which was so precise that even Graham Mercer could not dismiss it as an emotional reaction. Daniela had documented the time Vivian Hollis arrived, the reason her procedure had been postponed, the fact that emergency resources had been diverted to victims of the interstate collision, and the order Graham gave to move her to the third floor. She listed the names of everyone she remembered seeing in the hallway after the assault. She described how Vivian had entered a restricted corridor, taken her badge, accused her of following her, and struck her in front of witnesses. Most importantly, Daniela included the part Graham had hoped she would leave out. She described how he had treated Vivian as the victim before anyone had even asked what happened. She described how he had taken her badge without hearing her account. She described how he had told her to leave through the employee exit, not because there was a safety concern, but because he wanted the incident to disappear before anyone in the main lobby had a chance to notice. Daniela did not use dramatic words. She did not call Graham corrupt. She did not call Vivian dangerous. She did not try to make herself sound heroic. She simply told the truth in the clearest way she knew how. And that was exactly what made the complaint difficult to bury. By mid-morning, the document had reached the hospital's Human Resources Department, the Internal Compliance Office, and the legal team responsible for reviewing workplace violence incidents. Normally, Graham would have found a way to slow the process down. He knew how institutions worked. He knew that paperwork could vanish into review cycles, that meetings could be postponed, and that people often became tired before the truth became inconvenient for the right people. But this time, the complaint had arrived on the same morning that Horizon Medical Alliance was evaluating St. Alden for a potential merger. That timing changed everything. Samuel Reed had already disclosed his personal relationship with Daniela to Horizon's ethics office before stepping into the conference room. He made it clear that he would not be involved in deciding whether Daniela's complaint was valid, whether discipline was appropriate, or whether the hospital should face legal consequences. He understood that Daniela deserved a fair investigation, not a favor disguised as justice. But he also made something else clear. Any hospital seeking to join Horizon's network would be evaluated not only on finances, equipment, and patient volume, but also on culture. A hospital could have polished floors, impressive fundraising brochures, and a long list of wealthy supporters, but none of that mattered if employees were afraid to report violence. None of it mattered if administrators allowed money to determine who received care and who received protection. To Samuel, the question was no longer whether St. Alden had a public relations problem. The question was whether St. Alden had a moral problem. Graham tried to answer with the language he knew best. He spoke about confusion. He mentioned that Vivian Hollis had felt threatened. He suggested that the situation had unfolded quickly and that everyone was still gathering facts. But the more carefully he spoke, the more obvious it became that he had never intended to gather facts at all. He had gathered influence. He had gathered fear. He had gathered the silence of people who believed that protecting themselves was safer than protecting the truth. Samuel did not argue with him. He did not need to. He simply asked that the meeting be paused while Horizon's clinical review team received an updated report on the hospital's employee safety policies, donor access procedures, and incident response records from the previous 12 months. That request sounded routine. For Graham, it was devastating, because St. Alden did have records, and records had a way of remembering what frightened people tried to forget. While the executive offices struggled to contain the growing problem, Lillian Park sat alone in a small staff lounge on the 3rd floor, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. She had worked at St. Alden long enough to know how these situations usually ended. The person with the least power became the easiest person to blame. The employee who followed policy was called difficult. The patient, donor, or executive who caused the harm was treated carefully, gently, almost respectfully, as though their status had transformed bad behavior into a misunderstanding. Lillian had seen it happen before. Years earlier, A surgical technician had reported that a visiting physician was verbally abusive towards staff. The technician had been told that he was too sensitive. Another time, a nurse complained that a board member's family member had entered a restricted unit after visiting hours. The nurse was quietly moved to a less desirable schedule 2 weeks later. No one said the transfer was punishment, but everyone understood why it happened. Lillian had never forgotten those moments. She had also never forgiven herself for surviving them by staying quiet. When she saw Daniela leaving through the employee exit the afternoon before, something inside her had broken open. Daniela had not been reckless. She had not been rude. She had not gone looking for conflict. She had simply done what nurses were trained to do: protect the people whose needs were most urgent. And for that, she had been humiliated. Lillian opened her work laptop and began searching through staffing records. At first, she only intended to confirm Daniela's transfer to the 3rd floor. But as she reviewed the scheduling logs, she found something else. The transfer order had not been entered through the normal staffing system. Graham had called it in directly to the shift supervisor, bypassing the usual documentation process. There was no written concern about Daniela's performance, no formal complaint from Vivian, no safety note, no record that Daniela had done anything wrong. There was only the abrupt transfer. Then Lillian found an email from 3 months earlier. It had been sent by Graham to a small group of department managers. The message was brief, but its meaning was unmistakable. It instructed staff to make reasonable accommodations for Vivian Hollis and her family whenever possible, especially when they visited the hospital for non-emergency care. The email did not openly say that Vivian should be allowed to skip triage rules. It was more careful than that, but the wording left little room for interpretation. Graham had encouraged staff to treat the Hollis family as exceptional. In a hospital, exceptional treatment could become dangerous very quickly. Lillian read the message 3 times. Then she forwarded it to the compliance office. She added a statement of her own. For the first time in years, she did not soften the truth. She explained that Graham's approach had created a culture in which employees believed powerful donors could complain their way around medical policy. She described how staff members had learned to avoid conflict with Vivian even when her requests were unreasonable. She admitted that she had not spoken up sooner because she feared retaliation. Her hands shook as she pressed send, but after the message disappeared from her screen, Lillian felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt lighter. Not because the fear was gone, because she had finally stopped allowing fear to decide who she was. Across the hospital, Dr. Megan Blake was facing a different kind of battle. Megan had become a doctor because she believed medicine was an act of courage. She had imagined courage as the ability to work through exhaustion, make difficult diagnoses, deliver bad news, and stand steady when families were falling apart. She had not imagined that courage could also mean speaking when everyone around her was silent. The moment Vivian slapped Daniela had replayed in Megan's mind all night. Each time she remembered it, she saw something new. She saw the way Daniela had not moved toward Vivian. She saw the way Vivian grabbed the badge first. She saw the way Graham arrived and immediately turned his attention toward the woman with money instead of the nurse with a red mark across her face. Megan knew exactly what had happened, and she had said nothing. At first, she told herself that it was not her place. Then she told herself that security cameras would reveal the truth anyway. Then she told herself that she had patients to care for and could not risk creating more chaos. But beneath every excuse was the same ugly fact. She had been afraid. Megan had heard stories about Graham. Everyone had. She knew he had influence over staffing, promotions, and performance reviews. She knew he could make a person's work life miserable without ever saying anything that could be proven. But by the next morning, another thought had become impossible to ignore. Daniela had been afraid too, and Daniela had still done the right thing. Megan went to the compliance office and asked to provide a statement. At first, the investigator looked surprised. The official report from the previous day contained no mention of an assault. It only referred to a disagreement involving a donor and a staff member. But Megan spoke carefully and directly. She said she had witnessed Vivian strike Daniela. She said Daniela had not threatened Vivian or moved toward her. She said she saw Vivian pull Daniela's badge before the slap. Then Megan said the words that mattered most. She said that Graham had never asked her what she saw. The investigator wrote everything down. By early afternoon, the hallway that had been silent the day before was beginning to speak. Not loudly, not perfectly, but enough. The next witness came from a place no one expected. Mrs. Helen Ward had spent most of the day waiting for her daughter, who finally arrived after traffic from the interstate accident had eased. Helen had been tired, frightened, and overwhelmed by the hospital environment. But when she heard from a nurse that Daniela had been sent home after an incident, she immediately asked to speak with someone in charge. Helen did not know anything about Vivian Hollis. She did not know about the Hollis Foundation, the merger, or the executives meeting upstairs. She did not know Samuel Reed's title. She only knew what she had seen from her room. She told the investigator that Daniela had been kind to her when she felt alone. She described how the nurse had explained her condition, adjusted her blanket, and made sure she understood what was happening. Then she described the woman who entered the hallway angry and loud. Helen said Vivian had accused Daniela before Daniela had even spoken. She said she remembered hearing Vivian claim that Daniela had followed her. But Helen knew that was impossible, because Daniela had been on the floor long before Vivian arrived. She had seen Daniela checking on patients, speaking with nurses, and helping near the observation rooms. Helen's statement did more than confirm the assault. It destroyed the story Vivian had tried to create, because it established that Daniela had not been following anyone. She had been working. Meanwhile, the security department was reviewing the cameras. Graham had assumed the hallway footage would be unclear. He remembered that the third-floor corridor had been under renovation months earlier, and he believed the camera near the restricted access sign had been removed or turned at an angle that would not capture the confrontation. What he did not know was that the hospital had upgraded several cameras after a previous incident involving an unauthorized visitor. The system had been designed to store footage automatically on an external server, not on equipment controlled by the local administration. That meant no one inside St. Aldan could quietly erase it. The security supervisor, a man named Robert Kell, had worked at the hospital for 14 years. He was not easily impressed by wealthy visitors or executive pressure. His job had taught him that truth often looked different from the first story people told. When he reviewed the footage, he found exactly what everyone feared and hoped to see. Vivian entered the restricted corridor alone. Daniela was already there, assisting with patient care. Vivian approached Daniela first. Daniela did not chase her, threaten her, or block her way. She simply spoke to her from a respectful distance and gestured toward the public hallway. Then Vivian took Daniela's badge. Then Vivian slapped her. The camera did not capture every word clearly, but it captured enough. It captured the truth. Robert also pulled the access control logs. Vivian had not been authorized to enter the third-floor staff corridor. Daniela's badge had been scanned on that floor because Graham had ordered her transfer there. The timeline matched Daniela's complaint perfectly. The evidence was not emotional. It was not opinion. It was not influenced by money, fear, or reputation. It was time-stamped. And because it was time-stamped, it was almost impossible to deny. When the footage reached the compliance office, the tone of the investigation changed immediately. What had begun as a workplace complaint became a formal review of assault, retaliation, donor influence, and administrative misconduct. Vivian Hollis was contacted by the hospital's legal department and informed that the incident was under active investigation. At first, she reacted with disbelief. She insisted that Daniela had provoked her. She said she had felt threatened. She implied that the hospital was turning against her because a powerful outsider had become involved. But then she learned about the camera footage. For the first time, Vivian's certainty wavered. She had spent years believing that money protected her from consequences, not because she thought of herself as a villain, but because she had grown used to a world that rearranged itself around her. Restaurants found tables, offices returned calls. People apologized even when she was the one who had behaved badly. She had mistaken accommodation for respect. She had mistaken fear for loyalty. And now, for the first time in a very long time, she was discovering that neither could change a recording. Graham Mercer reacted differently. Vivian was angry. Graham was terrified. He knew the video alone could end his career. But the deeper investigation threatened to expose more than one bad decision. As compliance officers reviewed emails, staffing records, donor access notes, and executive communications, they began to see a pattern. Graham had not merely tried to protect Vivian after the assault. He had been protecting her for years. The record showed that Vivian and her family had received access to appointment slots outside normal scheduling procedures. On several occasions, staff had been pressured to move other patients, sometimes without clear medical reasons. There were emails where Graham described the Hollis family as essential to the hospital's future and encouraged managers to avoid upsetting them under any circumstances. He had never written the words that made the arrangement illegal. He was too careful for that. But the intent was everywhere, in the unusually fast responses to Vivian's complaints, in the special treatment notes hidden inside administrative emails, in the way staff members were warned to be flexible whenever the Hollis name appeared, in the way Daniela had been moved without documentation, and in the way Graham had tried to send her out through the back door before anyone could ask questions. The investigation revealed something else that made the board even more alarmed. The Hollis Foundation had not actually completed the donation it had promised for the pediatric expansion. The public announcement had created the impression that the money was secure, but much of the pledge was still tied to conditions, deadlines, and naming rights negotiations. Graham had been behaving as though St. Alden already owed Vivian everything. In reality, the hospital had been bending itself around money it had not even received. That fact changed the atmosphere inside the boardroom. For months, the trustees had feared that challenging Vivian would jeopardize the hospital's future. But now they had to consider a harder question. What kind of future did they have if they allowed people with money to control medical decisions? By the end of the second day, the board called an emergency meeting. It was not public, not at first. The hospital's lawyers advised caution. There were employment laws, privacy concerns, possible criminal charges, and contractual obligations to review. But everyone in the room understood that the situation had moved beyond internal discipline. Daniela was invited to attend with a representative from the Nursing Association. She did not want Samuel beside her at the table, not because she did not appreciate him, but because she wanted the board to see her clearly, not as someone's fiancé, not as the person connected to Horizon Medical Alliance, not as a symbol of embarrassment for the hospital. She wanted them to see her as what she had always been, a nurse who had done her job. The meeting took place in a conference room on the top floor, a space with glass walls overlooking the city. It was the kind of room where people discussed budgets, expansion plans, and public image. On the walls hung framed photographs of groundbreaking ceremonies and smiling donors holding oversized checks. Daniela noticed those photographs when she entered. For a moment, she wondered how many people in those pictures had ever considered what happened to the staff members who made their institutions function every day. The nurses who stayed late, the technicians who kept equipment running, the housekeeping staff who cleaned rooms after tragedy, the receptionists who absorbed anger from frightened families, the people whose names never appeared on plaques. Vivian sat near the opposite end of the table with her attorney. She looked composed, but her confidence was different now. The sharp certainty from the hallway was gone. She had read the investigation summary. She knew the footage existed. She knew the witnesses had spoken. She knew that the hospital no longer needed to choose between protecting its employees and protecting a donor, because the donor had become the very thing the hospital needed protection from. Graham sat several seats away. He looked smaller than Daniela remembered. Not physically, but in presence. The man who had once controlled the hallway with a few cold instructions now kept his hands folded in front of him, as though he could make himself less visible by becoming still. The board chair began by summarizing the findings. She spoke in careful, formal language. She described the documented assault. She described the improper suspension of Daniela without investigation. She described the failure to follow workplace violence procedures. She described the evidence that donor influence had affected staffing and patient access decisions. Then she spoke about institutional responsibility. That was the moment the room changed. Because until then, the case could have been treated as a conflict between Vivian and Daniela. But the board chair made it clear that it was not. The failure belonged to the system. Vivian had committed the assault. Graham had enabled the cover-up. But the hospital had created the conditions in which both believed they could act without consequences. The chair then invited Daniela to speak. Daniela stood slowly. She had prepared notes, but when she looked around the room, she realized she did not want to read them. She did not want her words to sound rehearsed. She wanted the people who had spent 2 days discussing liability and reputation to understand what the event had felt like from the inside. She explained that she had worked at St. Alden for 8 years because she believed in the hospital's mission. She had cared for patients who could not pay, patients who had no family, patients who arrived angry because fear had made them feel helpless. She had never expected every day to be easy. She understood that hospitals were stressful places, but she said there was a difference between stress and injustice. She said the slap hurt, but it was not the part she would remember most. What she would remember was looking around afterward and seeing people who knew the truth choose silence because they believed the truth would not protect them. She said that no employee should have to wonder whether their safety depends on the social status of the person hurting them. She said that no patient should have to wait longer because someone wealthy believes their comfort matters more than another person's survival. And she said that no hospital should call itself a place of healing while allowing fear to become part of its culture. Daniela did not ask for revenge. She asked for change. She asked for a policy that protected employees from violence, regardless of who caused it. She asked for a clear process that prevented donors, executives, or board members from interfering with clinical triage. She asked for a confidential reporting system so witnesses could speak without fearing retaliation. And she asked for training that would teach staff what to do when they saw harm happening in front of them. When she finished, no one applauded. It was not that kind of room. But the silence this time was different. It was not fear. It was shame. Vivian's attorney spoke next. He attempted to frame the assault as an isolated lapse in judgment. He emphasized Vivian's years of charitable work, her contributions to the city, and the stress of the moment. He suggested that she had become overwhelmed after being told her procedure was delayed. But the argument sounded weak against the evidence. Stress did not explain entering a restricted corridor. Stress did not explain taking Daniela's badge. Stress did not explain inventing a false story. And stress certainly did not explain why Vivian expected the hospital to punish the woman she had struck. When Vivian finally spoke, she did not offer a full apology. Not yet. She said she regretted that the situation had escalated. She said she never intended for Daniela to be harmed. She said she had felt ignored and disrespected. But even in that moment, she still spoke as though the greatest injury had happened to her. Daniela watched quietly. She understood something Vivian did not. An apology that begins with self-pity is not an apology. It is another attempt to avoid accountability. The board adjourned for private deliberation. The decision took several hours. During that time, Samuel remained outside the process. Horizon's legal team had advised him not to participate in any decision involving Daniela directly, and he respected that boundary. But he sat with her in a quiet waiting area near the executive offices, not speaking much, not trying to solve anything, simply making sure she did not have to face the day alone. At one point, Daniela asked him whether he thought the board would actually do the right thing. Samuel did not answer with certainty. He had worked in healthcare long enough to know that institutions often changed slowly, even when the truth was obvious. He knew that board members worried about lawsuits, public image, donor relationships, and financial stability. He knew that people sometimes chose the least painful option instead of the right one. But he told her something else. Whatever the board decided, the truth had already changed the hospital. The hallway was no longer silent. The witnesses had spoken. The footage existed. The emails existed. And once people had seen how fear had shaped their choices, they could not pretend they had not seen it. Late that afternoon, the board called everyone back into the conference room. The chair read the decisions one by one. Vivian Hollis was immediately banned from all non-emergency access to St. Alden Regional Hospital. She would no longer be permitted to visit the hospital as a donor, guest, or member of any advisory group. Her foundation's naming rights agreement for the pediatric expansion was terminated. The board also voted to return all unused funds tied to the naming arrangement rather than allow the hospital's future to remain connected to her influence. For Vivian, it was a blow unlike anything she had experienced. Her name had always opened doors. Now it was being removed from one. The board also confirmed that the hospital would cooperate fully with law enforcement regarding the assault. The security footage and witness statements were turned over to the district attorney's office. Vivian's wealth could hire attorneys. It could delay some things. It could soften some public embarrassment. But it could not make the video disappear. Graham Mercer was suspended immediately pending termination proceedings. The board cited his failure to protect an employee, his improper handling of the incident, his retaliation against Daniela, and his repeated use of donor influence to interfere with hospital operations. A separate audit would review every case in which special treatment had been given to high-profile donors or board-connected individuals. For Graham, the punishment was more painful than losing a title. He had built his career around being indispensable. He had convinced himself that he was protecting the hospital by keeping powerful people happy. He had told himself that compromises were necessary, that everyone benefited from the money, that someone had to manage difficult personalities. But now the truth was impossible to avoid. He had not protected the hospital. He had weakened it. He had taught staff that policy could be bought. He had taught donors that influence came before ethics. And he had helped create the exact environment that allowed Vivian Hollis to believe she could strike a nurse and walk away untouched. Daniela was formally reinstated with full back pay for the time she had been placed on leave. The board issued a written apology, acknowledging that the hospital had failed to protect her. It also committed to establishing a new Employee Safety and Witness Protection Council, led jointly by frontline staff and independent compliance officers. Daniela was asked to help design the program. At first, she hesitated. She did not want a title given to her as a gesture. She did not want to become a symbol used in a press release and forgotten once the headlines faded. She wanted assurance that the council would have real authority, real reporting channels, and real protection for employees who spoke up. The board agreed. Lillian Park would serve beside her. Dr. Megan Blake volunteered to help create mandatory training for physicians and staff on bystander intervention, workplace violence, and ethical escalation. The program would teach people how to document incidents, how to intervene safely, and how to report retaliation without losing their jobs. For Megan, it was not enough to say she was sorry. She wanted to make sure the next person in her position would know what courage looked like before it was too late. Helen Ward received a letter from the board thanking her for her statement. She laughed when her daughter read it aloud, saying that she had only said what anyone should say when they see someone being treated badly. But that was exactly why her statement mattered. Helen had no title, no influence, no professional obligation. She had simply chosen not to look away. The criminal case against Vivian moved more slowly than the hospital investigation. Legal processes often did. Months passed. News outlets reported on the suspension of Graham Mercer and the termination of the Hollis naming agreement. Public reaction was divided at first. Some people praised the hospital for acting. Others argued that Vivian's years of charity should not be erased by one terrible moment. But the security footage changed the conversation. Once people saw what had happened, it became difficult to describe it as a misunderstanding. Vivian eventually accepted a plea agreement on a misdemeanor assault charge. She was ordered to complete community service at a nonprofit medical clinic, attend a behavioral accountability program, and remain away from Daniela. The court also required her to make a financial contribution to an independent employee safety fund, though Daniela made it clear that she did not want the money treated as forgiveness. No amount could undo what happened, but it could help protect someone else. Vivian's community service was not glamorous. The nonprofit clinic served people who had no insurance, people who worked multiple jobs, people who delayed care because they could not afford it, and people who had spent years being treated as invisible by systems that were supposed to help them. For the first time in her life, Vivian had to stand in a place where no one cared about her family name. She was not introduced as a donor. She was not given special access. She was asked to organize supplies, prepare waiting areas, help with basic administrative tasks, and listen when patients needed directions. At first, she resented it. She moved through the clinic with the stiff posture of someone who believed she had been unfairly reduced. But week after week, she saw people waiting patiently for care they could not afford. She saw exhausted mothers trying to keep children calm, She saw elderly patients apologizing for asking too many questions. She saw nurses working through lunch because there were too many people to help. And slowly, painfully, she began to understand something she had never understood before. Being treated with dignity was not a privilege. It was the minimum every person deserved. Whether Vivian truly changed was something no one could know immediately. Real change was not proven by one apology, one court order, or one act of public humility. It was proven over time, through choices made when no cameras were watching and no consequences were guaranteed. But one thing was certain: she would never again walk into St. Aldan Regional believing the building belonged to her. As for Graham Mercer, the investigation continued long after he left the hospital. The audit uncovered several other cases in which employees had been pressured to accommodate donors in ways that compromised policy. Some incidents were small, others were more serious. In every case, the pattern was the same. Graham had treated the hospital's ethical boundaries as flexible whenever money was involved. He lost his position, his influence, and the trust he had spent years pretending to earn. No one sent him out through a back exit. No one needed to. His choices had already made every door close. Months later, St. Aldan Regional Hospital began to change in visible ways. New signs appeared near staff entrances and waiting areas, clearly stating that violence against healthcare workers would not be tolerated, regardless of a visitor's status, connections, or financial contributions. A confidential reporting line was created. Security procedures were strengthened. Donor relations were separated from clinical decision-making. No executive could move a staff member or interfere with triage without written documentation and independent review. The changes did not erase the past, but they made it harder for the past to repeat itself. Daniela returned to work gradually. Her first day back on the 3rd floor was harder than she expected. She had told herself that she was ready, but when she stepped into the same corridor where Vivian had slapped her, her body remembered before her mind did. The polished floor, the restricted access sign, the sound of carts rolling in the distance, everything brought the moment back. For a few seconds, she stood still. Then Lillian appeared beside her. She did not say anything dramatic. She simply stood there, close enough to remind Daniela that she was no longer alone. Soon after, Megan joined them. She looked nervous but determined. She had spent the past few weeks helping develop the first staff workshop on intervention and reporting. She told Daniela that the session had filled faster than expected. Nurses, doctors, technicians, and support staff had all signed up. People wanted to learn. People wanted to do better. Daniela looked down the hallway. The same place that had once witnessed silence was now becoming part of a different story. Not a perfect story. Not one where everyone suddenly became brave, but one where fear was no longer allowed to be the final answer. Over time, Daniela became known for more than what had happened to her. She became one of the strongest voices in the new Employee Safety Council. She listened to staff members who had been afraid to report harassment. She helped younger nurses understand that professionalism did not mean accepting abuse. She worked with administrators to make sure policies were not just words on paper. And every time someone told her they were afraid to speak up, she remembered the hallway. She remembered the badge being pulled from her uniform. She remembered the sting of Vivian's hand. But more than anything, she remembered the silence. Because silence had been the true enemy. Not only Vivian's arrogance, not only Graham's corruption, not even the hospital's fear of losing money. The real danger had been the moment when decent people saw wrong happening and convinced themselves that it was safer not to get involved. Daniela understood that courage did not always look dramatic. It did not always arrive with power, influence, or a perfect speech. Sometimes it looked like an older patient giving an honest statement. Sometimes it looked like a doctor admitting that she had been afraid. Sometimes it looked like a nurse forwarding an email she had kept hidden for months. And sometimes it looked like a person refusing to let humiliation turn them into silence. One afternoon, nearly a year after the incident, Daniela stood near the emergency department entrance as another busy shift began. The hospital was crowded again. Ambulances arrived. Families waited. Nurses moved quickly between rooms. The work had not become easier. Hospitals were still complicated places. People were still tired. Mistakes still happened. But something fundamental had changed. A young nurse approached Daniela after dealing with an angry visitor who had shouted at her near the waiting room. The nurse looked shaken. In the past, she might have apologized for causing trouble. She might have tried to handle it alone. Instead, she reported it. Security responded. A supervisor documented the incident. Other staff members stood beside her. It was a small moment. Most people would never hear about it. But Daniela watched the young nurse walk away, knowing she had been protected. And she felt something settle inside her. That was what justice looked like after the headlines faded. Not only punishment, not only public shame, but a world made safer because someone refused to accept what used to be normal. The day Vivian Hollis slapped Daniela Cruz, she believed she was punishing a nurse for forgetting her place. What she did not understand was that Daniela had never forgotten her place. Daniela's place was beside patients who needed care, beside co-workers who needed protection, beside the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. And in the end, the woman who thought the hospital belonged to her learned the lesson she had spent a lifetime avoiding. Money can buy attention. It can buy access. It can even buy silence for a while. But it cannot buy the right to take another person's dignity. And when enough people finally choose to speak, even the most powerful lie begins to fall apart. If you believe no one should have to stand alone against injustice, share your thoughts in the comments. And remember this: sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not look away.